Hello, this is a guy who likes fanfiction and is too lazy to read, so here is Protector of the Fairies in audio form. Check the description for the links to the author. Protector of the Fairies. The Twisted Fate of the Dead. Well, that's odd, Grammy stated as he glanced up at the sky. The bright blue barrier that surrounded the base had shattered and he could see the black energy leaking out through the massive hole in the top of it. Did things go badly for His Majesty? I better fix that. With a snap of his fingers, the energy released was gone and the barrier had been completely repaired. That's better, he added, turning back towards Gray. What do you think? Gray only stared silently at the Quincy in response, struggling against the chains around him. They had wrapped all around his arms and legs, avoiding any possible contact with his skin, but he almost had it. Pulling his right arm down a tiny bit more, he finally managed to get the tip of his pinky to brush against the chains. It may have been for only a moment, but a moment was all he needed. The second his skin made contact, the chains became nothing more than ice sculptures, easy to shatter as he ripped himself free. Impressive speed. It seems I was right in that it's your skin that causes the ice. Are you releasing it from certain extremities? Or is it something to do with your skin in general? You must be feeling quite hot. Gray scoffed. If anything, I'm cold. He didn't miss the slight frown he saw Grammy make. That wasn't the first time he had seen the Quincy make such actions. It was always when the Quincy spoke about him and what condition he was in that caused some kind of reaction in the Quincy. Was something happening he wasn't aware of? He wanted to sigh. There was a lot in this fight he didn't seem to be aware of. Like how Grammy had done what he had done to Kisuk, or how he had altered some of the room. One of the newest additions was the skylight in the roof. It had been perfectly flat for a time, and when the ceiling had shrunk down on them, how it did he never would know. It was only after he tore a hole through the roof with a pillar of ice in a mist attack had it become something else entirely. What had been a large, uneven hole had been made perfectly even with a glass layer and some kind of fancy border. And all that had happened in the time it had taken him to blink at the sight of his ice vanishing. Whatever this Quincy was doing, it worried him. It was the only thing that had made him pause in using his Ice Age spell. Well, that and the fact Kisuk would never be able to avoid the attack in his state and his control wasn't exactly what he would call excellent enough to avoid the Shinigami. But even if he could cast the spell, how long would the ice be there before Grammy made it vanish with whatever he was doing? If he could just work out the trick, he was sure he could find a way to win. Was his magic being dispelled? Was Grammy using a form of creation to manipulate the area? Maybe even both? No, that still didn't explain some things. And it certainly didn't explain what he had just seen. All of the energy Ichigo's Bankai released had been erased and all the damage done to the barrier had been reversed. Was this some kind of time manipulation? It was certainly possible, but he hesitated on pursuing it any further. All the stuff Grammy was doing was far too advanced to be completely separate branches. No one could have mastered them all to such levels at his age. Are you done? Grammy asked, snapping him out of his thoughts. The Quincy was patiently waiting for him, Grammy's hands in his pockets like he always did when he was resting. Then there was this. This way the Quincy treated him. Like a play toy, something to use until the excitement ran out and could be discarded. He would have been insulted to be treated this way if it wasn't so helpful for buying him time to figure out what Grammy's ability was. Yeah, Gray replied carefully, opening his palms to the air as ice formed from their centers. Twin swords, both made of pure ice, came to rest in his hands and the weight of them gave him some comfort. Then he rushed at Grammy, uncaring about how obvious his path was. Grammy wasn't bored of him yet, so he knew that whatever attack came at him wasn't going to be an attack Grammy was certain would kill him. As he expected, he was right. Before he was even halfway towards Grammy, guns had formed all around the Quincy. To his eyes they appeared to be just like the standard magic rifles he had seen some mages use over the years. That didn't explain how they were able to float in the air like that or how they were able to fire at him without anyone pulling the trigger. Thinking fast, he swiped up as the first round of blasts came, the ice sword in his left hand shattering. It had served its purpose, however, getting him through the first round of attacks. More ice was already forming as he rolled beneath the second barrage, avoiding the blasts by the skin of his teeth. As he came out of his roll he slammed his left hand against the ground, both pushing him back up and releasing the ice he was creating into the ground. He didn't need the ice to spread far, just allowing it to move ahead of himself and raise a large ice wall before him. As it shot up, he dug his remaining blade into the wall, allowing it to pull him up with it just as holes were torn as magic bullets tore into his temporary sanctuary. Pulling himself up and using his sword as a springboard, he leapt over the wall and slammed his hands up, letting them trail across the ceiling before he fell. From his touch spread ice all across the ceiling, something he used to his advantage as he slammed his hands together. From above he shaped all the ice he was spreading into sharp icicles and sent them flying down, the plan being to force Gremmy to counter the barrage with one of his own. He should have known Gremmy wasn't going to play by the rules. Every one of the falling icicles vanished in midair while the guns continued to trail on him, the sound of new rounds being loaded clear to his ears at this range. He was still falling too, so he would never be able to dodge easily. Acting quickly, he reached for his shirt and tore it off. As the guns made to fire, he threw the shirt down, his magic acting before it could leave his hand, and froze it solid. All it took was one foot to press down against it and leap forward, the barrage of bullets missing him completely as he sailed down towards Gremmy. One hand came back, ice forming around his fist as he prepared to slam it into the Quincy and freeze him solid. It would have worked normally. Not once had the Quincy tried to attack him physically, and the way the Quincy moved seemed to indicate he was entirely unused to fighting himself. His body didn't have any signs of strength in it, nor did Gremmy's actions show any level of heightened speed. But even so, the Quincy had one ability that meant that wasn't even a factor to worry about. Right before his fist could make contact, Gremmy vanished, as did all the guns. He knew where the Quincy was even before he turned. Glancing over right shoulder, he found the Quincy standing near the wall's edge, far further than the Quincy should have been able to dodge to under normal circumstances. "All right," Gray asked finally. "What is your deal? How many abilities do you have?" "How many?" Gremmy tilted his head, his smirk never vanishing as he did so. "Is that how you perceive my ability?" "Well, of course. How else would you explain your power?" "I just think you lack the imagination to visualize it," replied Gremmy. "You cannot comprehend the truth, so you try to find another explanation for it. But there doesn't have to be one, because I wish there to not be." There it was. The amusement Gremmy had shown multiple times, as if aware of a joke only he knew. "But regardless," Gremmy added as he took a step forward away from the wall. "Is this all the tricks you have up your sleeve? If so, I'll be quite disappointed, but I guess I would have to live with it and move on to others." "I'm not even started," Gray bluffed, even though he was panicking internally. He needed a plan, and fast. For the time being he would have to try and keep Gremmy invested and allow the fight to drag on. An opening would come, he just had to be patient. For starters though, he had to make sure to keep Gremmy's focus split. Reaching down, he carefully removed his shoes, letting his bare feet press against the ground and leave patches of ice around where he stood. He could see Gremmy's eyes spark with interest, knowing the Quincy now had the answer to his previous question on his power, but he couldn't bring himself to care. Exposing his skin now would make anything touching it get cursed by his own power, and so even Gremmy's constructs would be no exceptions. And if Gremmy decided to ignore the ice patches, it would just give him ammo for later on when necessary. Kicking off quickly, he charged straight at Gremmy like before. Rather than guns appearing, however, he was faced by an entire row of flames, stretching up towards the ceiling from the ground. He could tell Gremmy wanted to force him to run around and would likely have something ready to strike at him the second he turned the corner. So he didn't bother doing that. Instead he threw himself straight through the flames, not even getting a single burn from them and leaving them frozen behind. If Gremmy had thought flames would slow him down, then he obliviously didn't know who he had spent half his life fighting with and against. Landing on the ground past the frozen fire wall, he slammed his hands back against the ice and let the shape morph. Spears sprung forward and fired in mass, not a single drop of the ice being wasted. Gremmy could have easily made them vanish like he had done before, but this time it seemed the Quincy didn't want to do that. Instead the Quincy decided to match him, axes, swords, lances and all other kinds of melee weapons forming in the air around him. As each ice spear approached, a weapon was fired to intercept it, resulting in a massive clash between metal and ice. With the last ice he had to work with gone, Gray charged forward, using the brief time it took for the last ice spear to be intercepted as cover to move behind. Right as he prepared to take another step forward, however, a wall appeared right before him, causing him to almost run face first into it. Coming to a stop just in time, he prepared to charge right around it, only to find Grammy appearing in his field of view as he turned. All he did was take a single stop and a new wall appeared before him once again. Spinning, he saw the process repeat on the remaining two sides, leaving him trapped with only one way out. Up. Preparing to jump, he halted when he was suddenly plunged into darkness when the last opening sealed itself shut. Seriously? He asked, pressing a hand towards where he knew he could feel a wall. A frown crossed his face when he felt nothing, however, his hand pressing against thin air. That was odd. Last he checked, he had been standing in the middle of these walls, so there shouldn't be enough room for him to be not touching the wall. So where was it? Spinning around, he tried the process on each other wall. The same result. What had Grammy done? It had to be the cause of that Quincy. He briefly tried moving around a bit more to find a wall before settling on an answer. However he had done it, Grammy had formed additional walls while he had been trapped and then covered them all with the same ceiling that had first blocked his sight. That way the darkness would remain as the original four walls vanished. However, didn't that mean this was a perfectly enclosed area? He felt himself smirking despite the situation, crouching close to the ground as he lowered a hand towards it. Ice Age. He felt it all. As the ice spread across the 6 surfaces of his cage, he could feel exactly where the walls were with his ice. Grammy had expanded them out far, but not far enough for his ice not to reach. With a snap of his fingers he had the ceiling and walls shatter into tiny pieces, floating down to the ground as tiny specks of ice. Grammy was waiting for him the second he did so, watching from beside Kisuk's body. That was quick, and certainly a much more interesting way to break free than I normally encounter. Most aren't this nice to look at. Grammy frowned as he glanced at the ice floor, and a second later all the ice was gone, the floor back to the state it had been originally. Almost. I like this place looking perfect, so it bothers me when things ruin it and I have to work to repair it. I'm surprised you bother with such things. I thought you would leave it to the grunts you guys use. The soldat? Please, they would take far too long. Grammy paused for a second before his eyes seemed to narrow as they stared at him. Grey Fullbuster. I remember now. I thought your name sounded familiar, but I couldn't make the connection. You're that human turned demon, aren't you? Oh? You know me. Crap. He didn't like that look he was getting now. Had Grammy gotten bored and planned to take this seriously? He still hadn't figured out what the man's ability was. Each clash seemed to point towards another possibility. I do. Which makes this so much more fun. Withdrawing a hand from his pocket, Grammy pointed towards Gray. Or at least that was what it looked like to his perspective until he heard Grammy say 4 words. Say hello to her. Gray frowned but reluctantly glanced over his shoulder, ready for any trick or surprise. Whatever it was, it wouldn't beat him easily. And all those convictions shattered when he came face to face with the woman he had killed, Juvia Vastia. Protector of the Fairies. Slicing through arrow after arrow, Toshiro had little choice but to continue to retreat back across the courtyard, his opponent never far behind him. With every step they both took, however, the one in control of Yuzu's body drew a tiny bit closer. She had claimed to be Masaka Kurosaki. He'd admit he didn't know much about the woman. In fact, this would be the first time he had ever heard her name. Karen had never mentioned her once in their brief time together, and Ichigo had let slip so little about her even after all the years they had trained for. To the Kurosaka family, the name Masaka was a topic they were reluctant to touch on, he had assumed. However, hearing Masaka speak, hearing how she spoke about Yuzu and the love he could hear in her voice, he had no doubts that the woman's claims were true. She wasn't quite like what he had ever expected, and certainly was different from the small facts he had heard from Ichigo. Apart from her kindness towards her daughter in front of him, she had quite a vicious side to her. Apparently the Masaki Ichigo knew was a kind individual to everyone, even when angry. The result was that the woman in front of him was going all out to try and kill him. She had said he was a threat and was acting in response to that, while all he could do was fall back and try to plan. Going on the offensive like normal was something he was severely reluctant to do. The mind may have been Masaka's, but the body? That was Yuzu's. If he killed Masaka here, it would also result in the death of Yuzu herself as the host body. Normal Bakuto was also proving ineffective too, since every time he tried to use one it was either broken apart within moments or his attempts were interrupted before he could finish the chance to strengthen them. His only solution was to utilize his ice. Masaka shouldn't be able to unravel his ice like his Bakuto. The only difficult part would be creating a trap to contain her in without killing her in the process. If she was weak this would have been easy, but her continuous assaults coupled with the strength behind each strike was leaving him little room to act. A chance of tactics might be necessary for the moment. He just really hoped this wouldn't hurt too much. As he continued to dodge and deflect arrows, he let his eyes track each one in turn. An arrow for the heart, he couldn't let that hit. An arrow aimed at his eye, a tilt of the head had that skimming past his ear. An arrow to the ankle, a quick step back disrupted his movements briefly, which required a quick slice from his sword to deflect the arrow that was aimed for his neck in that next moment. Focus. He had to focus. Finally his chance came as an arrow shot towards his sword hand, attempting to either disarm him or force his hand further away from his body in preparation for a second shot. Rather than dodging, he instead shot straight forward, bracing his hand as the arrow slammed into it. It dug in deep, as he expected from such sharp arrows, but the ice surrounding his hands shielded him from most of the pain. He could see that Masaki hadn't expected such an action from him, and the result was a moment's hesitation from her. That hesitation was more than long enough for him to close the gap between them, his sword slashing up just as she made to fire another arrow at him. Her bow shattered as his sword sliced up, ice spreading out from the tip of his Zanpakuto and leaving a faint chill in the air as it froze anything in its path. Normally this might also include the enemy if he had sliced into them, but his blade had failed to draw blood. He had make sure to keep his strike far enough away to avoid that. With her bow gone, he now had more time than he usually would to act. Energy was already gathering at Masaka's fingertips as his sword came back down, but he knew it would be far too late for her to stop him. His sword stabbed straight into the ground by her feet and let ice spread out from the point of contact, freezing the ground around the two of them and having the ice creeping up Masaka's legs. It would only take a second for the ice to completely spread from her feet to her neck, leaving her unable to move or form any kind of counter-attack. That had been what he had expected. There had not even been close to enough energy being gathered to form a full bow from Masaka, so he had completely expected to have caught her. What he hadn't expected was the sudden release of an arrow straight into his right shoulder, disabling the limb enough that he felt his arm go slack. His eyes shot to the source of her attack only to see a small but complete bow, held by the fingers of her right hand. She could fire an arrow from that tiny thing? And one with this much power? It was his turn to hesitate, and that pause halted his ice, just long enough for Masaka to break free and retreat back a few steps away from the ice. Considering how she just ripped herself free, he had expected to see some kind of damage on her, but none was present. Not even a single drop of blood being left on the ground as she stepped away. Pressing his left hand against his shoulder, the familiar sensation of healing Kita beginning to work its magic, he eyed the pattern visible on Masaka's skin with wariness. Blood veine? That was pretty strong even by blood veine standards in his opinion. Was this where her talent lay in? Manipulation of her own blood? Seems you worked out my secret, Masaka stated as she pulled up her sleeve, fully revealing the pattern to Taoshiro's eyes. He was wrong. This pattern was different from the usual blood veine he had seen. But why? It's my script, Masaki explained, speaking patiently as if she was teaching him an important lesson. The shield. It mutated my blood veine into the form you see now. In terms of defensive power, some have said I possessed the greatest they had ever seen. If I stay in this form I can neutralize even some of the strongest attacks out there. Well, that was true during my time at least. It's hard to say how this power would hold up nowadays with only me using it. But even so, I'm pretty proud of it. It more than makes up for my lackluster offensive power. Lackluster? She called this lackluster? Well, regardless, he could see exactly why people would be wary of such a power. Wait, how strong was this defense in the first place? Would his attacks even be able to hurt her with it active? Any ideas of doing anything but sealing her in place were thrown out of the window in a heartbeat, knowing for certain that this was the only way to stop her. Now all he had to do was Volstandig. He froze as the suddenly increase in magical power hit him. He paid for that hesitation when a new arrow shot out of the burst of energy and almost took his head off. The size of that arrow was ridiculous. It was almost impractical to use from the look of it too. His gaze locked onto Masaki as the energy died down somewhat, the wings and halo of Volstandig bright around her. It was different from what he had expected, though to be fair he hadn't been sure what to expect. This was Yuzu's body but with Masaka's magic. He hadn't know what Volstandig would look like, especially when Masaka's magic was present because of Yuzu's magic. But the result answered all his questions. The wings of Yuzu's normal Volstandig still were present as was the same five-pointed star. The difference now though was that a second smaller star hovered over the first, far more solid than any of the halos he had seen thus far. A second pair of wings had also joined the first, these ones more like giant plates locked against one another like armor. The threat however lay in the twin auras of light surrounding Masaka's hands, all the energy she could gather around her being drawn to those 2 points. In her left hand some of the energy shaped up and down to form a makeshift bow while her second hand came to rest against the first. Drawing the hand back, he could only watch as the energy struggled to pack itself into a large arrow, the bow being bent back slightly and almost snapping. Then the arrow fired and he remembered to dodge, the arrow smashing into the ground not too far behind him. "Still can't get it quite right," Masaka commented with a smile, one that really didn't match the mood in his opinion. "I can make up for my lack of power in Volstandig but these arrows are really not suited for long range much. Luckily you don't want to go too far from Miha." Was she goading him into retreating back so she could utilize a trap? Or was she honestly happy he was staying close so she could use this power? He honestly couldn't tell and that worried him. Another arrow was already being made when he finally came to his senses and he wasted no time in trying to intercept her. With his arm healed now, his sword came up to slash through the arrow but he hadn't anticipated how much power was really packed into such an arrow. As a result he found his sword ripped from his grip under the force of the blow and spinning through the air behind him. Unfortunately he couldn't afford to retreat right yet. Now when he was this close, even disarmed, he was still dangerous so long as he had his Dragon Slayer magic. Ice Dragon's grip. His hands shot out and grabbed her by the wrists before she could retreat. He hadn't quite expected the contact to burn him though, forcing him to immediately let go and for the ice he had been trying to spread to break immediately. How much raw magic did she have around her hands that it could actually burn him through contact? Was she truly funneling the whole power of a Volstandig straight into her two hands and nowhere else? My turn. He barely dodged as the arrow was released, the energy slicing through the air by his left side and even managing to leave a rip across his clothes from the close contact. It landed not that far behind him once again too, adding more weight to Masaka's words about this being unsuited for long range. It appeared to be that the own weight of the arrows was causing them to dip down after traveling just a short distance, all the power they had being gained from the distance they lost. Retreating back further, avoiding the arrows as they soared towards him, he ducked down under the last just as he reached his sword and grabbed it once again. With the familiar weight in his hands he was more than prepared for the following arrow, slicing through it this time with an awareness of the power packed in it. He still felt his hand shake from the impact but this time his grip held strong. What he didn't expect however was for there to be so much energy when he sliced the arrow in half, the two sides still slamming into him. They had lost more than enough power to avoid piercing him but each made him feel like he had been hit with a hammer. Slicing them like that was out of the question unless he had no alternative. He needed a plan to get in closer and use a stronger spell to freeze her. Luckily he had the perfect one to use so long as he could get close. First came knocking her back. Darting forward with a burst of Shunpo, he appeared right before her and slashed down. He had to believe that this attack wouldn't hurt her else he wouldn't be able to utilize it. As he expected, his sword swatted her away without a single drop of blood being split, Masaka digging her feet into the ground after skidding back a few meters. In that time his sword had finished its arc, the tip pressing against the ground and leaving a snowflake-shaped crystal where it touched. That was one. Two arrows came at him quickly, one after the other, and forced his path to divert as he began to circle her. On the surface he supposed it looked like he was looking for an opening and that could be said to be true. Halting for a moment as he noticed Masaka trying to cut him off with another arrow, he let his foot press against the ground for longer than normal in order to plant the second marking. That was 2. Seeing Masaka trying to retreat back further, he knew he had to act while he had the chance. These markings would be useless if he couldn't trap Masaka within them. Shunpo had him catching up with her before she could move far, slashing out with his Zanpakuto and releasing a dragon of ice directly at her. That same dragon was shattered into pieces the moment an arrow slammed into its head, tearing through its body from head to tail. It had served its purpose though as he came to a stop, the third marking being set down. 2 more, and in fairly tricky places. If he ended up back where he started he knew it would look suspicious. So rather than go towards his targets he instead moved away from them. Patience. That was the key to any trap. He had to not rush until the very end and just try and keep her within the area he wanted. Circling back the other way carefully, he came to a stop briefly opposite the area he wanted to be in before rushing forward, straight into the path of a suddenly released arrow. His sword came up as fast it could and sliced into it, the two halves slamming into him and almost forcing him back. But he weathered through the pain, leaping over Masaki and lashing out with his blade as he did so to keep up the illusion. She was only knocked back a step this time, but it was enough for him to land cleanly behind him, turning his head back round towards her just in time to release a breath attack at point-blank range. It was a gamble. A strike like that could just as easily send her flying out of his bounded area. But after seeing the shield in action he trusted its ability to weather through such an attack. In the time his attack was active he used the chance to retreat back further, digging his foot into the ground where the fourth marking needed to be and placing it on the ground. The moment his attack ended he began to move, arrows being fired at him in quick succession. Calmly, without urgency, those words kept repeating in his mind as he forced himself to not rush. A final arrow rushed towards him just as he was about to reach the final point, barely avoided as he ducked down beneath it and slammed his hand into position. The final marking formed and, before Masaki even had a chance to move, 5 lines of ice had spread from the markings and locked her in place. "Got you," Taoshiro muttered. "Rokui Hyukatsujin." The ice shot up in a pentagon shape, trapping Masaki entirely in the pillar of ice. He couldn't lose focus yet though. This attack had to be used to seal her, so as a result he carefully stopped the ice right before it reached her head. All she needed was air right now. Once the barrier was done, Kisuke could arrive and examine her for any solutions he might have to offer. Or maybe Hades, as reluctant as he was to trust the man. "So that's what you were up to. I thought you were just darting around the place and looking for solutions." Though maybe he should seal her mouth at least. Hearing Masaka speak through Yuzu's body was kind of unsettling. "I guess I really am out of practice. That's what being dead will do for you. Just stay quiet for a bit," Taoshiro stated as he turned to look towards the direction Karen was back in. He would need to go check on her quickly while he could. He hadn't sensed anything near her during the battle, but he could have easily missed something. If she had been harmed while he had been fighting, he'd. Instincts kicked into the sudden buildup of magical power, just in time to have him bring up his blade in time to block the arrow suddenly fired at him as his ice prison shattered. His blade didn't hold, snapping in two at the point of contact as he was sent flying backwards through the air from the arrow. It wasn't the ground that finally stopped him but the object he had hit, a large gate with the symbol for a sun etched above it in its frame. He began to groan as he struggled to his feet. That had hurt. Looking up he could see Masaka walking towards him in the distance, and he was sure he could see that smile still present on her face. Ice still clung to her but he could see that it wasn't harming her in the slightest as she broke it away from her skin. Had he not made it strong enough? Or was it because he had still shown leniency in fear of killing Yuzu? Or maybe it was simply all the energy Masaka still had from her Volstandig. She was closer now and he could still see the bright aura of energy around her hands glowing just as brightly as ever. He couldn't restrain her like this. Not with a broken blade of such weak ice. He was oblivious to how Masaka suddenly came to a stop, surprise on her face as she stared towards him. Instead all he was focusing on was his blade, gripping it tightly as he began to let his magic rise. Bandash. A hand landed on his shoulder before he could finish, interrupting his magic as his focus shifted to the source. His eyes widened immediately as he took in the sight, the gate he had crashed into before now opened wide with what appeared to be bright blue energy making up its portal. But it was the man with his hand on his shoulder that was shocking him the most. Ishine Kurosaka's grip tight as his eyes looking only towards his daughter and wife. "Is Karen all right?" Ishine asked, and it took him a moment to realize that question was directed at him. He quickly gave a brief confirmation before Ishine let out a sigh of relief. "Good. Go to her and make sure she stays safe. I'll handle this." "Hold on a minute. That's not just Yuzu there. It's Dash. Masaki, right?" Ishine chuckled dryly at Taoshiro's pause. "I knew the minute I sensed her magic. I would never forget the magic of the woman I love. Go. Protect Karen. I'll handle this." Taoshiro glanced between the two for a moment before finally nodding and taking off in a run. Masaki made no moves to stop him as he passed her focus locked completely on Ishine. And he was pretty sure that he had seen her usual smile vanish, replaced with one filled with far more love in it than the one directed at him. That was all he had the chance to see before he sped past, praying to anyone that could listen that Karen was still safe where he had been forced to leave her. Staring at the sight of his daughter, Ishine let out a sigh before turning towards the portal, just in time to see another man enter through it. "Go ahead, Ryukin. I'm going to handle things here." Ryukin took one look at Yuzu before realizing what he had already noticed. "I'm sorry," were his only words before he took off like Taoshiro had, disappearing further into the complex just as fast as he had arrived. "Well then," Ishine said finally to Masaki, a soft smile being directed towards her. He wasn't even sure himself what emotion was being shown. Was it happiness? Was it pain? Was it regret? Maybe it was a bit of everything if he was to be honest with himself. "It's been a long time, Masaki. I've missed you." "And I've missed you, Ishine," Masaki spoke back softly, taking a step towards him before pausing. "I'm sorry. I can't let you past here." "Why not?" "You know why." "I'm confident that you do." "I know," Ishine replied sadly. "But I need to hear it from you first." Masaki nodded slowly. "All right. Because Waiwak would want me to stop you, and I want to ensure his vision for the future comes to pass. It's honestly a wonderful future, Ishine. One of pure beauty and peace. I'm sure it is to you." Ishine let out a sigh, unable to hide his disappointment. "I was prepared for this. But it really hurts hearing it. I knew from the moment I realized the truth about Yuzu's power that if she ever managed to bring you back it would be like this. Your soul didn't pass on like most because you had been touched by the magic of Waiwak. Your soul went to him, your power went to him, and you've spent all these years seeing things from his point of view. Just like every other soul that has become a part of him. I wish there was another way here." As Ishine drew his sword though, he knew his words sounded just as weak as his hopes. "But all I can do now is stop you and save my daughter from you. And trust me, these are words I never wanted to ever say. Masaki. I'm going to stop you. Protector of the fairies. Hibiki. Did you find out what happened to Ichigo's magic?" Hibiki shook his head, taking a moment to turn away from all the screens surrounding him and to face Shinji. "Nothing. It's like the energy of his Bankai suddenly wasn't there. Whatever opening we might have been able to take advantage of was closed just as quickly as it appeared. But Ichigo is still alive, right?" "He is. I haven't dared contact him since he got us to reconnect with Wendy, but his magical power is still just as strong as ever." "That's a relief, I suppose," muttered Shinji as he leaned against the nearest window to peer out at the barrier below. "Any word from the others?" "The barrier is still up, despite our plan hinging around its destruction. I managed to get in contact with Kisuke the moment his vital signs went red. For some reason he is stuck at a near-death state. I'm not sure what's happening, but, from what I can tell from my scans, he should have been dead some time ago by now. Luckily his mind is working just as sharp as always. He managed to pass on some essential information and a request for help." "Help, huh?" Shinji frowned. "That's going to be a problem with the barrier in place." "I thought so too. So I took advantage of the opening we had for a few moments by Ichigo's energy." "Advantage?" The gears clicked in Shinji's head as he took note of the lack of teleporters in the room, a presence that had never drifted away once in times like this. Where are Mest and Nozomi? In the barrier. Well, Mest is. He took Mistogen along with him. I had Nozomi check out the odd readings I'm getting nearby. There are some high levels of magical power approaching us. You didn't think of contacting me earlier. You and Hades will be needed soon when the barrier drops. Fresh reinforcements can be deadly to tired enemies. Besides, you should get your chance soon enough. By now Mest and Mistogen should be nearing Gray and Kisuk to provide assistance. Between them all they should be able to think of something to stop the Quincy Gray is dealing with. Can you get me in anyway? Hibiki shook his head. Sorry. The barrier's defensives are back up. They only made it in because it got broken temporarily. Even if I wanted to, I can't send you in. Just as I can't send anyone else in. We just have to wait for now and hope they can handle it. For better or worse, they are on their own. Protector of the Fairies. Lost love. Deflecting the arrow with a flick of his sword, Ishine continued his path towards Masaki. Each arrow fired at him was stopped by Injutsu, but, to him, it still felt like his heart was being filled with holes. Each step he took was another step closer towards Masaki, his steps larger than the ones she could make with Yuzu's body, and that meant getting one step closer to the woman he now had to defeat. He had fought against her in the past. Whether it had been her wanting to test her skills, to practice something she had learned, or even because she had been angry at him for something he had done, none of it compared to what he had to experience right now. There was no real hatred in each arrow fired at him, but there was something else too. An uncaring attitude to whether he lived or died, even though she still cared about him. He hated it. Hated it more than he had hated anything in the world. And it was all because of Wywak. For taking her from him. For corrupting her by forcing her to see his and only his viewpoint for all these years since until she even began to agree with it. For having her now trying to fulfill his will over even her own wishes. Wywak had a lot to answer for, and he doubted even the man's death would be able to quell this hatred. But that was why he had to submerge those emotions and face what was in front of him. Masaki was lost to him. He couldn't save her. No amount of trying would chance that anymore. She was nothing more than a shadow of the woman he had loved, twisted into a new purpose by the actions of another. But Yuzu, one of his two precious girls, was still before him. He might not be able to save his wife, but he could save his daughter, and he was willing to take on any burden if it meant doing that. Masaki would have done the same in his shoes in a heartbeat if she had still been herself, willing to cut down anyone who would threaten Yuzu. And he was the same, even if his opponent was his wife. Unfortunately, he couldn't rely on brute force to solve this problem. Masaki wasn't occupying Yuzu in a physical sense but rather a spiritual one. The body before him was Yuzu's, linked to Yuzu's own life and with all that it entails. Cutting her down would kill her alongside breaking the connection to Masaki, and he knew he wouldn't be able to raise his blade to do that even if he wanted to. However, he also lacked any kind of magic capable of breaking such a bond. His knowledge of Kita was much more limited compared to other Shinigami, his focus having always been on his Zanpakuto and the few he did know. Retiring for a time had only forced him to waste even more time getting reacquainted with his dulled skills. Still, he did have the old classics to make sure he wouldn't be caught off guard. His magical power was still far above Masaki's own, especially when most of that power was coming from Yuzu herself, and he knew he could easily outlast her if it came down to it. Her attacks would also only stand a chance of taking him down if she really put a lot into it, which would only further fuel her loss of stamina. So the option certainly existed to wait it out and let her exhaust herself of magic. But the problem was, he noted as he dodged to the side and let another arrow fly past him, that he was operating on a time limit. Ryukin had said that they wouldn't be able to stay long here. Ichigo's assault could only sustain itself with its current momentum for so long before it would crumble. If the battle wasn't won soon for Ichigo, then things would take a turn for the worst, that he was assured of. As such, waiting was no longer an option. Masaki would not tire before that happened, and he knew he would never be able to leave so long as Masaki was in front of him like this. Even if it meant facing his death, he simply wouldn't be able to turn away and flee and ignore the sight he was fleeing from. That meant he had only one real option before him. This was Yuzu's power that summoned Masaki forth. Born from a wish to see her mother, a dream Yuzu had held onto for her whole life, he had no doubt this connection was the strongest the Wraith would be with any soul. But that was exactly why he had to try and get through to her somehow. If left alone, he was afraid she would never wake up from what had to have been a happy dream for her. As cruel as it was, he had to force her back to the surface and have her do the one thing none of them wanted to do. To reject Masaki. With a plan in mind, he swung his sword through the last of the arrows, just as he came within a few paces of Masaki. Her blood vein was active. Good. And it was even Masaki's own brand. He had been waiting to confirm that, and now that he knew exactly how much damage she could take safely. With a silent command, his Zanpakuto released itself, flames bursting to life around his blade as Injetsu released its own fury at the situation. He knew the sight must have shocked Masaki to see, and as he expected, she froze for a moment. That was all he needed. Injetsu wanted to burn the problem away, but he didn't let it. Instead, he swung down while keeping the flames grasped tightly around the blade, letting the blade scrap against Masaki as she took a step back out of its original path. With her blood vein active, he didn't even leave a scratch, but he didn't need to. His left hand came up next, appearing right before Masaki's eyes before she had a chance to react, and flicked with 2 fingers at her. Her blood vein could protect her from damage, but that was all it did. As such, nothing was present to stop the force from sending her flying back, crashing through walls as she broke through them without any sign of stopping. He chased after her just as quickly, his sword held tightly by his side just in case of any surprises in following her. One finally came when she flipped over in her flight and dug her heels into the air, slowing herself down as she raised a single hand towards him. The fingers made the motions quickly, and he had a single second to react, swinging his sword up just in time to intercept the sudden arrow launched at him. That move was nostalgic. He remembered Masaki making it, so proud when she showed it off and exclaiming it to be her solution to her aiming problem. And he had been impressed at the sight too. Even Ryukin had when he had seen the technique once. By creating a small bow with one hand, she could utilize it in many situations, such as when faced with enemies too close to escape from or just to hide her attack until it was too late. However, such surprises were lost on him. He must have seen this attack hundreds of times. Even her Vollständig had no secrets that he didn't know. Her power, to him, was an open book. She hadn't progressed any further from when she had died. In fact, if he was being honest, her Vollständig and blood vein were currently her only real threats in his mind. When they had both retired, their skills had dulled, but unlike him, she had never had the chance to reclaim that edge. She was still soft, lacking the trickery she would normally use in such fights. In a very familiar pattern, she fired out 3 more arrows in rapid succession in the time it took him to reach her. The first was aimed at his chest, trying to aim for central mass. The second was almost right behind it, aimed at his right shoulder, intending to disable his limp while it was still exposed from swinging to stop the first arrow. His only choice would be to dodge left in such a situation, putting him on a collision course for the third arrow aimed at his neck. It was one of her favorite combos when dealing with fast-moving enemies, particularly beasts. It was useless on him. His body moved on instinct, moving perfectly to avoid the second arrow and stopping right before his neck could end up in the path of the third. When you were aware of the purpose of the first 2 arrows, it was easy to stop yourself from overextending on dodging the second arrow and falling into the trap of the third arrow. Masaki tried to fire another arrow, but with one swift move he had her by the neck and threw her downwards, pinning her to the ground. His foot came down next, slamming down on her wrist and holding the limp tightly against the ground. Her other hand sliced towards him, the energy around it sharpening its edge like a blade's, but it only met steel as his Zanpakuto slammed into the ground in front of her path. His other hand quickly adjusted as it released his grip on his blade and instead grabbed her by her other wrist, making sure both hands were firmly secured from attacking him. "You got sloppy," Ishine stated, a chuckle slipping into his voice without him meaning to. "You weren't nearly as ready for that mission back then, were you?" Masaki gave a smile in return, making an awkward laugh of her own. "Would you have let me go alone if I had said yes? Things turned out fine anyway. I could deal with some hollows easily enough, even as rusty as I was. It was coming back that caused the problems. Ichigo got tricked by a hollow I thought I had killed. I can't blame him for it, It took me longer than it should have to realize the truth, and I'm sure it must have been horrible for him to see me die. For him, for Karen, for Yuzo, they must have hated growing up without a mother. I even heard Ichigo grew up without you too. At this words her voice turned stern, a glare directed Hine's way. What were you thinking, letting him run off for so long? Honestly Hine, I know you can be silly at times, but you should have brought him home the moment you found him. He wouldn't have wanted to back then. Besides, he was finding a home of his own in Fairy Tail. A home he wanted to protect. Maybe I should have approached him, but I didn't want to do anything to take that away from him. Besides, I was scared he'd reject me if I did show up. He always had the choice to come back, but he didn't. I always thought back then that it was because he believed I couldn't help him. You still should have tried, said Masaki as she lectured him. I would have. At this her smile returned as she spoke with a sort of awe in her voice. But we don't have to worry anymore. Soon, Waiwak will fix it all. Yuzo, Karen, Ichigo, they'll be able to grow up together as they should have, and I'll be able to watch them grow as I always wanted to. You'll be there too, though I'm not sure in what form. But I know it'll be a paradise. What are you talking about? Waiwaka's dream, of course, Masaki spoke, as if the matter was the simplest one in the world to her. When Waiwak gains Lumen Histoire, everything will be made right. All of reality will become his to mold, and a paradise on earth will form, one that will last for all eternity. No pain, no suffering, no tragedy. Just a world of pure beauty with a hand guiding it to ensure it never loses its path. Have you considered what cost of that dream will be? Hine shot back, almost disgusted at hearing such words come from Masaka's mouth. How many people will die to bring about his vision? Only a few million, Masaki replied, without a shred of shame in her voice. It's a small number really for such a dream. And you don't need to even worry about it, since once Waiwak has Lumen Histoire he'll be able to make all those deaths meaningless by making it so that they never happened. So really there's only a bit more suffering until eternal peace. That's perfectly acceptable. Perfectly acceptable. Those words. Spoken so happily in that voice. Masaki. He twisted you so far that I'm not even sure I recognize you anymore. Masaka frowned, trying to tilt her head slightly in confusion despite Hine's tight grip on her neck. I'm not sure what you mean. I'm still me, the woman you loved. The woman I loved would never have called the loss of millions of lives a justifiable loss. Hine shouted, unable to hide his rage any further. The woman I loved would have been disgusted at the idea of even a single life being taken for the betterment of another. She would have fought to her last breath to do what she thought was right, not submit to another's dream and accept such a truth without question. You are a mockery of everything she stood for. You are nothing more than a shadow now of the woman I loved. He felt his voice choke as realization set in. And the worst part? I know the woman I love isn't even out there anymore. Because this is her soul, twisted and morphed until all that's left is unrecognizable. Even in death, I'll never see that woman I married again. She's gone, forever. I'm right here Hine. Can't you see that? No. You're not here. Steeling himself, Hine buried his emotions once more to focus on what he needed to do. I think she knows now too. Don't you Yuzo? Yuzo? What are you? Masaka froze, her voice stopping mid-sentence. Ddy. When she spoke again, Hine didn't hear Masaki anymore. The voice was one of a young girl whose dream had been shattered, crying out to him for comfort that he knew he couldn't give. What did you do Hine? There was Masaka's voice again. Just as quickly as it came, however. This is Mummy. Yuzo's voice returned, the shook in her voice as if seeing something for the first time that she had been desperately tried to ignore. Ignore him, sweetie, he heard Masaka tried to say, but Yuzo didn't listen, her eyes slowly filling with tears as she looked up to him for answers. You always said she was so wonderful. That she was the kindest person in the whole wide world. Don't listen to him, Yuzo. He's trying to hurt you. You know that, right? You can see it, right? But he's doing it for my sake, right? Those things you said, you can't mean them. Please say you don't. Yuzo, just listen to Mummy. If you do, everything will be fine. I promise that we'll all be a family again soon enough. Just hang on a little longer dash. No. There was silence from both voices for a moment, Yuzu's defiant denial leaving Masaka speechless. When she finally did break the silence once again, her voice held only confusion. Yuzu? What's the matter? You wanted to see me again, right? Why are you so upset? You should be happy. Just like I'm so happy to be able to talk to you again. No. I don't need you. I don't want you. Not a monster like you. Yuzu, wait dash. No. Get out. I hate you. I don't need you. I never will. The blood vein pattern around Yuzu's body slowly began to flicker, switching between Masaka's own special brand and Yuzu's own normal usage until finally only hers remained. Only at this point did Ishine feel comfortable enough to release his grip on her, the conflict within Yuzu and Masaka progressing enough that he was no longer necessary. Please sweetie, think about what you're doing. You can't fight Waiwak. But with him, you'll get everything you've ever wanted. Your dream can become reality. I don't need it to, Yuzu replied as she got to her feet. Around her, the Volstandig shattered as tears began to fall from her eyes. I don't want such a dream. I'm happy without it. But Yuzu. I love you. I know, Yuzu replied softly, choking on her words as she clutched her chest. I did too. As the last drops of Masaka's magical power faded, Yuzu took a few shaky steps forward before Ishine caught her in his arms. He felt her grip tighten on him as he rubbed her back reassuringly, sobs she tried to muffle visible to his ears as he held her tightly. It's all right Yuzu, he muttered softly, hating himself for what he had been forced to do. She had loved her mother so much, all because of his tales of her. Even his exaggerations had never been too far off the mark. That was why she had wished so much to see her mother again. So to free her, he had to show her the reality of the woman Masaki had become without any filters to blind her. He had been forced to make her see a side of her mother that had never existed and had her reject her completely by her own free will. And doing so had ruined that image of a perfect mother forever, leaving nothing but a tainted shade in its place. However, she was safe. He didn't feel like smiling, not after what he had just faced, but he could still feel a few shards of happiness. His daughter was safe now, and to him that was all that mattered. Protector of the fairies. Juvia? Gray asked, speaking slowly as if afraid what he was seeing would vanish before him if he made any sudden movements. That's not possible. Is that what you believe? Juvia asked him, giving him a smile he couldn't help but recognize. That smile was the same one she had given him as she died. One not blaming him what he had done but instead accepting him regardless of his actions. It was the one that haunted his dreams, the one that kept him up at night remembering it in vivid detail. So to see it now, it was like he was living within a dream. Cut it out, Gray snapped out, turning his head towards Grammy. The Quincy before him simply continued to smirk, looking entirely unaffected by the issue before them both. I know what you're doing. An illusion, right? Some trick with my memories? Well, if you wanted to make me angry, I can guarantee that dash. He froze at the spike of magical power beside him. His head spun back just in time to act, leaping back as a jet of water slammed into where he had been standing. Tracing his eyes back to the source, he found it in the form of Juvia, her right hand in a water state from which the attack had come from. That's impossible, he muttered. This wasn't just a simple memory. It couldn't be, not when the magical power he could sense coming from her was an exact match from the woman he knew. If it had been an illusion, he was sure there should have been a trace of Grammy's magic in here, but instead it was all hers. Why is it impossible, Gray? Juvia asked him softly. Because you killed me? He flinched. Why did she have to say those words? It's all right. I forgave you even then, didn't I? Her smile was just as beautiful as he remembered it. And yet it was like something was missing. Like a piece of her was gone. I'm sorry about this, Gray, but I don't have a choice. Before he could even ask, she was on the attack. Her body was turning completely into water as she charged him. It was a reckless attack, one that he could easily halt. All he would have to do would be to place his hand forward and freeze. His hand dropped before he could even finish that thought, choosing to roll out of the way instead. The water torn through the space next to him before reforming into Juvia, her arms remaining as water as she swung out at him with water whips. Forming two blades of ice in his hands, he sliced straight through the water, letting the ice spread across it back towards her until she reformed her arms and abandoned the freezing areas. "You did this, didn't you?" he called out as he glanced towards Gremmy, doing his best to stay calm. "What the hell are you even thinking? You think Juvia even stands a chance against me? You're wasting your time." "Am I?" Gremmy let out a small laugh. "I don't think I am. But perhaps you are right, Juvia alone is not enough to stop you. So how about two? Two?" As he glanced back towards Juvia, he almost did a double take. His eyes weren't playing tricks, were they? Releasing his ice weapons, he took the moment to quickly rub his eyes, confident in Gremmy's arrogance to stay his hand. It didn't chance anything, which meant that what he was seeing was the reality before him. There really were two copies of Juvia in front of him. They weren't even mirroring each other either, since each was doing entirely different actions while they waited too. "What is this?" he found himself muttering, unable to hide his shock. Without realizing it, he had taken a step back and found himself hitting something. Immediately he leapt away from whatever he had hit, looking over his shoulder with haste only for his world to freeze once again. Juvia was there. Another. Glancing back towards the others in the hope it was all some elaborate trap, he was disappointed to find the original two were still standing there. What on earth was a third doing there? "You don't need to worry, Gray," said one of the Juvia copies, the others nodding before the copy by itself took over. "She's right. You know us, don't you? We are all Juvia," the last copy stated, the same soft smile still on her face. "Every one of us is the woman you remember. Do you not believe us?" "I don't think he does." "Maybe he'll believe me," spoke a fourth Juvia, this time coming from behind Gray once again. He spun round only to find a large difference being present in this Juvia. She was holding a baby, specifically her daughter. "Is this not proof enough that we are real?" she asked, glancing up on occasions as she fussed over the bundle in her arms. "Sorry, hold on. Really likes to grab my attention when she's awake, so I'm just trying to distract her to get her to go to sleep. Do you mind waiting a few minutes?" "This isn't happening," Gray muttered fearfully. "This isn't real." "But it is," came the voice of another Juvia. When he turned back around, he found there were even more copies than when he had last looked. There had to have been 20 of them, all perfect copies of Juvia, and yet all seeming to act independently of one another. "This is real. As real as anything can be in this world." "I think that is enough playing around, girls," Gremmy stated from the sidelines. "Attack." "Wait, what?" Gray asked in confusion before every Juvia around him struck. Beams of water tore through the air towards him from all directions, his only option to slam his foot against the ground and cause the ice around him to shoot upwards. The shield wouldn't last for long, but all he needed was a second. The moment the water hit the ice, the attack was as good as over. Ice spread out at all angles back towards the attackers, each Juvia breaking off their attack before it could reach their true bodies and waiting for Gray's next move. With a snap of his fingers, Gray morphed all the ice around him as it shattered, shaping hundreds of thin projectiles and firing them off in all directions. Every Juvia present merely shifted their body into water, opening gaps up where the needle projectiles would hit and allowing it to pass by safely, before reforming. That time though was all the time Gray needed to begin charging towards the largest pack, intent on scattering them and halting their attacks. He was only halfway when they managed to recover, the group ahead firing off blasts of water as fast as they could. Luckily he had a counter for that. Ice make, spinning disc. Leaping up and flipping in the air, ice spread out from his palms and forced the massive disc, using it as a shield as he let the water slam into it and freeze on contact. Throwing would be a pain with all the extra ice on, however, so he quickly delayed throwing it for a moment to focus on fixing that problem. From behind him came multiple water slices, forcing him to throw his altered disc, now covered in spikes, back to slice through the water paths, leaving a thin wall of ice between him and the other Juvia copies. In the moment he had turned, however, all the copies of Juvia that he had been forced to ignore charged, rushing at him as jets of high-pressured water. It was impossible for him to avoid them all. So he would have no choice but to charge through. A nice broadsword formed in his hands and he swung, only to pause right before it could hit one of the Juvia clones. His action served to make the clone confused, their focus split just enough for Grey to turn a head-on attack into a glancing hit across his side while avoiding this others. Ice froze his wound shut and even damaged the copy from the brief contact they had against his skin in their water form, but he had another problem to deal with. One that was far more pressing. "Damn it," he muttered in frustration. "Focus. They're copies, all weaker than you. This should be easy." Glancing around warily, he noticed how all the Juvia copies had begun circling him, slowly closing the ring and limited his ability to flee. If he charged quickly, he could still break out. The clones must have realized his intentions, he thought as they suddenly came to a stop, one hand raised up and firing off a blast of water into the sky. The water's path began to bend the further it went up until they all intercepted at the center, right above him, and pooling their power into one large condensed ball of water. The built-up of magical power he was sensing too. Shit. Unison raid. They were all essentially the same person, so why hadn't he considered such a possibility? Their compatibility with one another was higher than with anyone else. The water fired down from above, blasting towards him with the intent to crush him with sheer force, only for him to raise both hands just in time, a larger of ice spreading off from his palms and protecting him with one massive shield. It almost wasn't enough. He felt his knees buckle as he struggled to keep his footing, the force of the water alone threatening to break though. But like all other water attacks, it could only last so long against his ice. Within a few seconds there was nothing more than a giant sculpture of ice, slowly shattering to pieces. Blocking the strike had meant he had been unable to stop the clones reaching him, however, one slashing at him with whips of water and sending him into the waiting arms of another. Before he even reached her he was sent in another direction from a blast of water before a kick slammed into his chest and sent him right back the way he had come from. Enough. He swung out as he skidding back across the ground, ice firing from his hand and forcing all the clones around him back a few steps as they tried to dodge. In that moment he lunged at the nearest Juvia, a sword appearing in his arms and being swung downwards at her. One by one, he would eliminate each of them till there were none left. They weren't real. None of them were. Which meant all he had to do was cut them down. Despite thinking that, however, his sword still came to a halt an inch away from the neck of the Juvia copy in front of him. "I can't do it," he muttered, coming to the realization he had wanted to ignore as the sword slowly shattered in his hands. "I can't cut you down. Not again." "I know," said the Juvia in front of him, right before he was stabbed by water blades from all sides. He found himself glancing down just in time to see all the blades sticking out through his chest before each was withdrawn and abandoned as they began to turn to ice. Finally turning his gaze back to the Juvia in front of him, he saw a blade of water forming on her hand too. "I'm sorry, Grey." Her blade made its own hole through its chest alongside the rest before it was withdrawn and abandoned like the rest, leaving the wound open to the air. And then he fell, slamming face first into an ice-coated floor and lying there motionlessly as a pool of blood formed all around him. "Look at you," muttered Grammy, sounded almost disappointed to Grey's ears. "Such a waste. Your curse is even starting to fade now that your life is beginning to end. Here I actually thought you would be able to overcome them, but I guess now. Humans always seem to falter when faced with their regrets." He hated to admit it, but Grammy was right. The moment Juvia had appeared, he had lost. It didn't matter how much he tried, it didn't matter what method he used, he knew in his heart that he could not strike her down. Not again. The memory from before would always flash before his eyes right before he could, and even if it meant his death he refused to reenact it. He almost felt like laughing at his foolishness. Everyone was counting on him and yet he couldn't muster the strength to destroy an image of Juvia. Was this his punishment for killing her in the first place? Was that the true reason he had survived all this time, just to die at this moment by her hands as vengeance? "Sorry," he muttered weakly before his hand began to move, pressing down against the ground. It was difficult, but he still forced his magic to act. Ice quickly began to spread across his body and seal up his wounds, the ice turning red from his blood, while he struggled to his feet, barely able to stand. "If someone had to kill me, I honestly wouldn't mind if it was you. But please wait a little bit longer. I'll die for you after I'm no longer needed. He could see Grammy beginning to turn back towards him, shock appearing on the Quincy's face. He couldn't close that distance in time even when in perfect condition, but he could still try. So he lunged, one hand reaching desperately into his trouser pockets to grab the one item he carried that he cherished. He just managed to grab it when Grammy finished his turn, giving a single command to all the clones around them. Kill him. No you don't, Gray roared in defiance, pulling the item from his pocket free and allowing green light to flow around it. What he needed was not a weapon like his cross pendant had taken. A weapon like that to cut his enemies away was useless in his tainted hands. His eyes could do whatever job that required such acts. But with this item, it had to be pure. It had to be the only part of him that was still pure. Because clenched in his hands was the medallion that Leon had used to try and seal his demon side away, created from the man's own magic with Juvia's blood as a catalyst. However, he knew such power wouldn't be enough. So at the same moment he allowed every bit of his demonic power to break free from its chains. His time at Tartaros had been limited, but he had learned essential information to both demonkind and himself. As Deliura, he had an Aetherius form equal to Mardgear, Yukio, and Blue Note. But not once had he even dared try and use it in fear for what he would become. Using it meant accepting all his sins and facing what he was head-on, knowing there would be no going back after this. But so long as he was holding this medallion, he wasn't afraid. He felt a chance occur on some level. He wasn't sure how to describe it, just that it felt alien to him. He supposed this wasn't much of a surprise. Humans weren't meant to utilize forms like this. He wouldn't be surprised if Myra even felt something similar with her takeover magic. He felt his body break and remend itself, creating something new that he didn't know about. But on some level, the knowledge was beginning to flow forth. It was Deliura's memories his mind supplied, which was why he came to a perfect stop, unafraid of any attacks approaching him from the Juvia clones. To Grammy's eyes, the Quincy saw something that surpassed his imagination for a moment. All the attacks approaching Gray, coming from all directions, suddenly found themselves frozen in place the moment they got within a few meters of the man. He couldn't help the frown that crossed his face, the sight of something completely unexpected greeting him for the first time in a long while. What he found himself facing was not a demonic form like he had expected. Instead, Gray stood there with very little obvious changes to his basic structure. However, he couldn't help but shiver at the sight, a noticeable chill beginning to set into the room. He noticed it when Gray took a brief breath, a faint breeze of cold air visible the more the temperature dropped. His focus switched back to the man entirely as he tried to spot any major differences. The clothes were definitely new. They were pure white. He would have almost mistaken them for the same color he and other Quincy wore if not for the faint glow emanating from the clothes, as blue as the ice Gray used to make in color. It was also far more like a robe, with long, wide sleeves and collars. It was almost priest-like in his opinion, but for what reason a demonic form would become so saint-like he had no idea. From around the man's neck also hung a strange medallion, looking like it was made of frozen blood, and hanging there by a thin bit of white rope. Then there was the blood. Streams of it flowed around Gray, twirling around his arms and making small loops in the space behind his back. It was almost like the blood were ribbons to his eyes. Then there was the more obvious chances. The pure black hair Gray had supported before was now as white as snow, as was the man's eyes. Gray looked down at himself equally as surprised, taking in his full appearance for a moment. This was not the form Deliura was meant to take. He knew that in his heart. So why had he taken this form? His eyes narrowed as he glanced along his body for anything suspicious before finally settling on the medallion hanging from his neck, his eyes softening at the sight of it. So that was it. He had triggered his Aetherius form while still preparing to transform his Fullbring, and so instead of having the item being shaped into something to help him, it instead fused itself with his transformation. Considering the very nature of the medallion's purpose, it was no surprising his appearance was similar to that of a holy man's. It had been a medallion meant to seal away an evil being, and so it was fitting that this form would take such an appearance because of that. His eyes slowly began to trail around the room before he noticed how every clone of Juvia was shivering. Odd. Was it that cold in here? He didn't feel anything. Not a single drop of warmth, nor a drop of cold. But just looking at them, he could tell it had to have been freezing in the room. Finally his eyes landed on the frozen water, stuck in place from reaching him. He hadn't launched any kind of defense to block that. Was it because he was in his Aetherius form? Had his release released so much magic that it froze them in their tracks? Or was he the source of the coldness the others felt, water freezing solid the moment it got close to him? I think I have my answer, Gray muttered before he turned towards Gremmy. Would you mind moving back a bit more? I would appreciate it. Gremmy frowned, but he made no moves to move. Instead he sent all the clones of Juvia around him to charge forward. All that got, however, was a sigh from Gray, the man watching as their movements began to grow sluggish the closer they got to him. Don't worry, he stated softly. I won't harm you. The blood around his back suddenly sprung to life as he swung up with his arm, lashing out like a whip and grabbing one of the clones of Juvia in front of him. With a quick swing he thrown right behind him, and only then did he begin to advance. Only 3 versions of Juvia blocked his path, water being launched directly at him at point-blank range. It all froze almost the second it left their fingers. One of them even made the mistake to change her whole arm into water and paid for it when it frozen entirely solid. In their shock, it was a simple matter to leap over them, planting his feet solidly on the ground beside them before kicking the ground behind him with his heel. In an instant a giant wall of ice stood between him and clones, leaving him facing Gremmy alone with Kisuk's body safely away from their new battlefield. You know I can bring more of them. It's really not a problem for me. If you've got time, feel free, Gray offered. It's just I don't think you'll have the chance to. I really can't control this yet, but at least I know you'll die if I do this. Gray paused for a second before he realized something. You know, I suppose this can be called a legendary spell now in this form. My Ice Age was strong, and I suppose this can be considered its natural progression. What on earth are you? Gremmy was unable to get out any other words. It was impossible for him to do so, because the moment he tried he, and everything around him not separated by the ice wall, was completely frozen. There wasn't even time to admire such a sight either, as every bit of frozen ice that made up Gremmy slowly began to crumble away. Haka no to game, Gray spoke softly. Otherwise known as White Haze punishment. If any part of you can still hear me, you can ponder on who that punishment is meant for in the afterlife. He almost tripped as he made to turn away. He hadn't realized that attack would take up so much magic. But it was over. With this, victory is assured. Gray spun back round towards where Gremmy had been, seeing the crumbling remains of the Quincy. There was no way he had survived that. His ice sealed away magic, meaning that it was impossible for Gremmy to somehow escape or regenerate. And yet here he found a second copy of Gremmy standing beside the first, a look of pure anger crossing his face. I assure you, it isn't even close. Not so long as I don't believe I've lost. Protector of the Fairies. Illusions of death. Darting across the sky, high enough that he could feel his feet occasionally brushing against the barrier as he moved to dodge, Ichigo kept his distance from Waiwak for the moment. At such a distance it gave him plenty of time to dodge with ease, even if Waiwak tried to predict his path. It wasn't always perfect, Waiwak's ability to predict his actions almost counteracting his own superior speed, but that same focus was forcefully split every time the Quincy King tried to focus on him. By taking his eyes off Uriah, he simply opened up a blind spot in his defenses. Seeing a barrage of arrows rapidly approaching, Uriah temporarily kept on the defensive as Waiwak put pressure on him to stop him from interfering. Ichigo had little room to dodge in such a scenario. The barrier preventing him from retreating back any further, so his only choice was to tear right through them. Hundreds of arrows flew at him, but with his speed, increased from kicking off from the barrier, he shot down through the attack like a flash, his 2 cloaked swords cutting away any arrow that came too close. The arrows that he avoided all spun in the air and chased back after him, but he was far faster, appearing straight before Waiwak with one sword slashing down. It was blocked. His sword hit Waiwak's own as the Quincy King acted to halt his advantage, stopping him in his tracks. With the arrows immediately approaching from behind, he had little choice but to retreat back and slice his way through, leaving none left to continue to chase after him. This was the greatest problem he was having right now. Waiwak's reactions. He was moving incredibly quickly, but Waiwak was still able to block his attacks. Tiny bursts of Hiran Kyaku to adjust his position were used almost constantly by the Quincy King, enabling feats that should not have been possible considering the speed the attacks were coming in at. But when combined with Waiwaka's own predictive abilities, built up from analyzing the fight and accurately predicting their next moves, it resulted in a level of defense even this level of speed couldn't completely overcome. This was far different from his battle with Zeref. Maybe it was because Waiwak was mortal, lacking any regenerative abilities that he knew of, that made the Quincy King that much more dangerous in battle. There was strength through knowing your mortality, which explained why Waiwak had yet to let his guard down around them once. Energy-based attacks weren't the most effective too, limiting the usage of his Getchuga Tenshou. Waiwak had shown that he was capable of parting it with very minor injuries, and this was still without taking into account what the man's Volstandig had to be like. Which was also the same reason why he couldn't afford to use his Bankai's full power yet. Even if his time limit had increased, Waiwak still had an ace up his sleeve. And if the battle was drawn out into a long battle of attrition, he would be the first to fall if he relied on his Bankai's full power to overcome this barrier. Exchanging a glance with Uriah briefly, he knew what he had to do. Uriah still had that abyss break arrow he wanted to use. That wouldn't be so easy to stop, even if its target was Waiwak. And even if it did get stopped, it would open up Waiwak to other attacks in that moment. A moment he was sure to take advantage of with his speed. But first he needed to buy some time and get the pressure off Uriah. It was a task not easily done, but if he could make himself a greater threat for a moment, it might just work. Mavis. See any weaknesses in his guard? None, the girl replied, peering over his shoulder and down at the Quincy below. I don't see a single one. I had hoped for more really. Zeref had a ton of holes in his guard, but I suppose we can't get lucky all the time. If you can find something to exploit, however, you might be able to make him focus on you for a bit longer than normal. Is that so, huh? Bearing going full strength, there wasn't much he could do to force Waiwak to focus in him. Unless... I've got an idea, he muttered. Hoped to save this for a tougher situation, but it'll have to do. With a single kick off the air, he was soaring down towards Waiwak. Arrows shot towards his path, some massive in scale to either slow him down or force him into the path of others, but their movements were still too slow to Ichigo. One sword slashed down and tore into the largest arrow, splitting it down the middle as the energy around his cloaked blade shot forward. Any shards that tried to lash out at him were torn apart as he spun around in the air, both blades cutting any piece of energy to pieces before it could do more than twitch. It had still slowed him down for an instant, however. He could see Waiwak preparing his blade, a burst of Hiran Kyaku, all the Quincy needed to adjust his guard to block his strike. And with the other arrows around him adjusting their course to chase back after him, he knew it would play out the same way as before if he wasn't careful. But it wouldn't. Waiwak couldn't see it, but he was smiling behind his cloak of energy. Shooting down at Waiwak as fast as before, he raised one sword up ready to slash down. His momentum would simply add to the strength of his strike, and against a normal opponent they would find their blade shattering beneath his strike. Waiwaka's blade was one he knew would hold steady, however, but that didn't matter. All he needed was for the man's eyes to be stuck on him, watching his every move. He knew if Waiwak looked away then he would succeed in his strike, so the Quincy had little choice but to divert all focus to him, buying Uriah at least a second of freedom. Uriah needed more time than that. He would need far more. So he would buy it. As his sword came to swing down, Waiwak moved to block. And then he vanished, right before Waiwaka's eyes. He honestly had no idea how successful his phantom step would be against such an opponent. Using it against Uriah and Cobra in the past had shown it was not entirely effective against enemies who could act based on other factors beyond their sight. But then he had never used a phantom step of this level against anyone. Simply tapping into his full speed for a brief moment, a speed far higher than the one Waiwak had been getting used to, had enabled him to slip past effortlessly, and he was already spinning round to deliver what would be a crippling blow. He knew it wouldn't be that easy. Waiwak was stunned, but it hadn't been for nearly long enough. The man had undoubtedly followed the trail of magic to where he had moved to and was now spinning round himself to block. But he could see something new now. A crack in the armor. The back was one of the most exposed areas of the body since you couldn't see the attacks coming like you could from the front, and that was no exception for Wywak. That perfect defense of the Quincy took time to be brought round and, unfortunately for Wywak, he was faster. His blade struck, deflected slightly at the last second as Wywak's blade swung round. But it was too late to stop his attack making contact, tearing across Wywak's shoulder and leaving by his side. Shallow. The wound was far too shallow, even as blood leaked from it, but he would settle for that. This was the first injury like this that Wywak had taken since the fight began, and for the first time in the fight he could swear that Wywak was only seeing him as the enemy right now. Suddenly he found that it was him on the defensive, Wywak pushing him back as he launched a series of fast-paced strikes. He could see the switch Wywak made between blood veine and blood artery, so fast by normal standards that it might have been invisible to normalize, and each strike pressured on him forced him back another step in the air. Retreating back right now would be the best move, Wywak keeping pace with him at such short distances, but it appeared Wywak already had that idea considered. If he even tried to move back a bit further, arrows would bombard him from all directions. Even with his speed, he'd be hit on the way out. So instead there was no option but to retaliate. As fast as Wywak was like this, his actions still were easily visible to him. Aim carefully. Look for the moments in between attacks, right before Wywak had a chance to change his blood back to the defensive variant. That was when the opening would be. One such opening finally appeared and he struck out, Wywak reacting quickly and tilting his head out of the way as a sword sliced past his cheek, leaving a faint trail of blood as it hit. Attacking however opened up his own guard, an arrow breaking through his exposed guard and slicing through his side. Such damage was superficial, his flesh regenerating just as fast as it was torn away, and he could see Wywak knew it too as he took the opportunity to launch another strike in. Strike after strike they clashed, both dealing what amounted to superficial wounds to the other. But they both knew it would only take one right strike to alter the entire flow. For Wywak, all he needed was a blow that Ichigo's regeneration wouldn't be able to heal instantly. And for Ichigo, all he needed was a clean hit on Wywak to force him back. After what had amounted to merely seconds in their clash, a true opening appeared. Ichigo, overextended from a missed strike, found Wywak lunging for him with his sword, on a direct path to his chest. Reacting instinctively he kicked back off the air straight into the arrow storm, weathering through the arrows that slammed into his body. Some broke apart as they hit the storm of energy that surrounded him while others made it through, stabbing cleaning into his skin and staying there. His regeneration made to act but it was always slower when it had to clear away the obstacles in its way, weakening his arms for a moment that Wywak was clearly trying to take advantage of. His swing to knock Wywak back came too slowly for his liking, avoided by the Quincy before a sword sliced up at him. Blocking didn't stop it, the sword's impact sending him flying backwards across the sky right before his strength fully returned. Digging his heels into the air, Ichigo stared back at Wywak as the energy around the blade in his right hand burst to life with new power. Extending out massively, he swung the blade down with one loud cry. Getchuga Tenshou. And with a slice of his own blade, Wywak tore the energy apart, letting the rest pass behind him harmlessly. For Ichigo though, that didn't matter. All he could do was smirk before tilting his head to one side, just in time for an arrow to tear right through the air from behind him. Wywak's eyes widened at the sight, recognizing the arrow cleanly for what it was, and attempting to bring his blade to block. It didn't matter in the end. The arrow wasn't one that he could split with his control over magic. It was one that only sought a return to nothingness. The full power of Abyss Break tore into Wywak, shattering his blade and impacting him directly. Ichigo wasn't waiting to see the damage however. He had to assume that Wywak had survived that attack completely unharmed if he wanted to be still on guard. Speeding up and across the sky, using all the speed he could quickly muster, he arrived right at the point above Wywak before dropping straight down, both blades being coated with energy as he held them closely together with one another. The energy around both doubled instantly and continued to grow, some even being lost as it leaked away from the blade in his haste. That didn't matter to him however. He had to strike now while he could. All the energy that had been attacking Wywak was suddenly expelled, revealing Wywak just inches away from him. The man had been harmed from the attack, light burns covering the front of the man's body that not even blood veneer had been able to shield him from, but the man's focus was too slow to shift to him or his blades slicing down at him. Get Yuga feel? Like an arrow, the black energy around both of his blades tore down as he stabbed forward with both blades together. Whack was good at parting his attacks, so he'd like to see the Quincy part this one when all the energy was coming down in one spot. Whack's hand barely managed to catch the top of the energy and try to split it before the rest broke around his hand and slammed into him, forcing him out of the sky and all the way down to the ground. Both Ichigo and Uriu rushed right after him, Ichigo arriving first before Whack even did and swinging back up with both blades. Getchuga Jujishao. Both Getchuga strikes fused as they struck up, slamming into Whack's other hand as he hastily brought it rough to block the strike. However, he was still forced into it, the force from the attack above continuing to push him down towards the ground. A rain of arrows tore straight into the energy the moment Whack hit the ground, elements and magic of all type being fired straight into the mix. It didn't stop Whack from suddenly leaping out of the whole mess of magic, bloody from the arrows stuck in his chest and the burns from the Getchuga Tenshou. However, he had leaped right into where Ichigo wanted him, a foot slamming into him and sending him crashing towards the ground by Uriu's feet. A blade still slashed up at Uriu, attempting to sever the Quincy's head from his body, but Uriu was fast enough to avoid it by a hair's breadth with a single step back. And then he stepped back in, moving before Whack could stop him and doing the one thing he knew the Quincy King wouldn't expect. He placed a hand against Whack's chest. Before Whack could even process the action, a second hand landed on him, this time on his back. Energy slammed into him from both sides, but he knew it was different than before. It was not the energy of foreign beings but rather his own, twisted but still very much familiar. Absorb. All. His hand tried to raise to stop them, to swat at least one of them away from him. All he needed was a single arrow to form and he could stop them by forcing them back. But magic refused to respond to his will. The arrow wouldn't shape and he began to realize that he simply couldn't make it happen. His strength, his magical power, all of it was gone in the time it took him to blink again. And then, right after that, his life faded too as a blade tore into his chest when the hands separated. Watching hesitantly for a moment as Whack's body fell to the ground between them, Ichigo and Uriu didn't dare let their eyes drift away from it. To them, they were almost afraid it would all vanish before their eyes and reveal a false mockery of their feet. But the sight didn't vanish, nor did the large increase in magical power that he could feel coming from Uriu. Did it work? Ichigo finally asked. Is he dead? Uriu let out a sigh of relief, his Volstandig slowly fading around him. He let one hand rest against his head as he tried to get in control of his breathing once again, a lot of his own magic having been spent in the battle. Yes. We did it. God, that was tiring. Remind me to never try and keep up with Ukins like you and him again. Well, that's one down at least, Ichigo muttered with relief. Thought it would have taken far longer. You are technically at his level too. It shouldn't be too surprising that you can defeat enemies like this. Be thankful. It's one less Ukin to worry about now. And you should honestly be thankful that we got him at this stage. His supposed peak would have been impossible for us to match. Yeah, Ichigo muttered, letting his senses spread out more now that the battle was over and pick up on the others nearby. Huh? My dad's here. With Yuzu? I think. They're close to one another, right? Mavis nodded. Yep. Right beside one another. I think we missed something judging by the lingering foreign energy I'm sensing from her too. She frowned slightly. Mist Ogden and Mest are in here too, it seems. Heading for Grey, it looks like. They must have slipped in when we broke the barrier temporarily. That's Grey. Ichigo muttered, sensing the man's magical power. That's a lot stronger than anything he's ever pulled out before. Much more demon-like too. He has an Aetherius form and has the essence of one of Zeref's top 4 demons, Delira. What you're sensing is the full capabilities of such a being in action. What about Wendy and Gildarts? I'm having trouble picking them up properly. Not much of a surprise considering the magic leaking out from Gildarts. Wow, that's a lot. What on earth is he doing to be constantly leaking that much magic? He'll run out in minutes if he's not careful. Wendy though. She's in trouble, I'd say. Her magical power is very weak right now. It's recovering slightly, but we should be worried of who put her in that state. Is everyone else fine? Toshiro seems good to me, as does Karen. They'll both good. Together too, so they'll be fine. Ichigo nodded. All right. Let's hurry down to Wendy and Gildarts and give them a hand. What do you plan to do, Uriah? He frowned when he got no response, glancing towards Uriah. Hey, you there. Kind of, Uriah muttered. Sorry, it's just the stuff I'm seeing here. A lot of memories. Sorry about that. I didn't have time to focus on the power alone, so I just shoved everything out that I could. You need help discarding them. It's fine. The all is actually responding well to them, categorizing them all and slotting them away like a book on a shelf. It's just. Just what? Uriah sighed. Blanks. I'm getting blanks in here. We probably just missed stuff since we were in a hurry. It's fine. Go on and get to Wendy. Ichigo shrugged. All right. If you're sure. Turning away, he glanced around for the nearest entrance back into the buildings. They were pretty close to the throw room, so he had a rough idea of where they were at least, and if it came down to it he could always retrace his steps. His Bankai was still active, so he had the time. He paused right before he could leave, however, turning back to look at the body. Something still felt off. Something he was only just now noticing. Mavis. I'm noticing it, Mavis replied quickly. This sensation. We did kill him, right? What is it? Uriah asked, looking down at the body. You think he's still alive somehow? In a form of hibernation to recover? I'm not sure. It's just I never saw anything odd in magic when I cut him down after we were done. Probably best to be sure. Raising one blade, he allowed energy to build up around it as he prepared to swing it down. In the same moment, Uriah's frown deepened before finally his eyes widened, a realization coming to him as he grasped the power inside him. Ichigo. WA-. Too late. A sword stabbed straight through Ichigo's chest, Uriah's words giving Ichigo only enough time to try and dodge. Rather than hitting his heart, instead the blade just stabbed past it. There was no rest, however, a hand grabbing Ichigo by the neck and ignoring the energy that tried to fight back against his grip. Blue lines continued to spread from the hand grabbing him and began to cover the whole of his cloak of energy. I will take back what is mine. It was like fire that suddenly been plunged into Ichigo's veins. Every nerve in his body was screaming, and for once it was not something his regeneration could save him from. A power tore further, however, reaching for beyond what was visible before finally reaching his very soul. And then it tore its way in and tore out a piece. When the blade was finally withdrawn and the hand released its grip, Ichigo could do nothing but fall to his knees, his eyes blank as his mind and soul tried to recover from the pain he had just endured. And behind him, standing without a single hair out of place, was the man he and Uriah both feared. Well now, Waiwak said as he stepped around Ichigo's form. Shall we stop this play and move on to reality? Protector of the Fairies. Taking a long look at the copy of Gremmy, Gray frowned for a brief moment before the details finally clicked into place. So that's it. I've figured it out. Your power is imagination. Oh? Why so sure? Because of everything I've seen. There's too much variation for it to be all one branch under normal means. Especially when it comes to those copies you made of Juvia. They are as real as can be, or at least as best as can be made by someone like you. And now finally I see an exact copy of you in front of me, sharing every detail the one I killed did. A power like this is like spitting in the face of reality, so what other power could cause this but the imagination of one's mind made into reality? Very good, replied Gremmy, a sneer across his face. And? What difference does it make? Perhaps I should simply stop playing around and do to you what I did to your friend. Gray shook his head at the words, however, not a single thought worrying about such a threat. If you could, you would have done so already. But you can't. You already tried. Pressing a hand against his chest, Gray let out a small sigh. I don't know whether I can even consider this a blessing when it comes from a curse. But no matter how much you try, you cannot simply kill me with a thought. Everything freezes upon mere contact with my skin and seals away magic within a layer of ice. Magic like yours simply cannot penetrate that barrier without being destroyed, leaving you to try and defeat me with alternative methods. Guns, fire, even Juvia, they are all methods for you to compensate for the fact that you can't just will me dead. Now then, Gray added as he brought his hand back down. I should avoid dragging this out too long. I've no idea what effects I'll have on the world by staying in this form, and I'd rather avoid finding out. So let's finish this quickly. I'll kill you as many times as necessary till you have no copies left. Raising his hand, the ribbons of blood around Gray began to move, swirling around his arm and expanding out. Gremmy didn't make a visible move, but weapons of all kinds still appeared anyway, all being launched directly at Gray. But with a single swing of his arm, the ribbons of blood shot out, slamming into countless projectiles and turning into pure ice the second they made contact. A few weapons slipped past, but Gray easily avoided them as he began to take steps forward, keeping his eyes locked on Gremmy for any signs of danger. Ice vanished all around him as Gremmy made his move, and he knew immediately that every Juvia copy behind him was about to attack. The ice that had been blood immediately unfroze, revealing the streams of blood once again that snapped back towards him as he spun round. With a wave of his hand he had them all lash out at his attackers, knocking them back before he kicked his foot lightly forward against the ground. Another giant wall of ice formed, stretching all the way up to the ceiling, only for it to vanish again after mere moments. So Gremmy didn't intend to let him separate them from the battle. That was a pain. But then he wasn't even sure how well he would have been able to use his legendary spell anyway a second time round. He wasn't nearly experienced enough to control it like the others. Rather than trying to keep the copies back, he instead spun to face Gremmy and charged, putting as much distance as he could between him and any version of Juvia. He knew Gremmy would teleport away if he got too close, so he would have to be fast and catch the Quincy off guard. Freezing was the best way to do so. If he froze the Quincy faster than he could react, it would be certain death. Right before he could take another step, however, giant walls burst up before him, each layer immediately turning into flowing streams of lava that threatened to engulf him. His hand merely slammed straight to the magma, freezing the whole thing solid before snapping with his fingers. The ice immediately reshaped, forming one giant icicle that launched straight at Gremmy. Right before it could hit the Quincy, it split straight down the middle, both sides slamming into the wall behind where Gremmy stood. A ribbon of blood immediately lashed out at the Quincy, dodged by a hair's breadth as Gremmy leaned out of the way, and impacted directly against one half of the ice. Suddenly all the blood was frozen once again, a link made between Gray and the broken ice. All it took was a snap of his fingers and the ice was all reshaped, transformed into hundreds of daggers and blades before being launched right back at Gremmy. The Quincy was fast enough to realize something up, but was far too slow to turn, teleporting away the second he felt the pain. It did no good at all. The moment Gremmy reappeared, as far away from Gray as he possibly could be, his back was already frozen and the ice was spreading across his entire body. He could see the pure terror on Gremmy's face even at a distance, and, despite the Quincy's attempts, nothing could save Gremmy from being frozen completely, leaving nothing but a sculpture of ice in his place. That would have been in the end normally. Except he could still sense Gremmy's magical power. A brief glance around revealed another Gremmy standing up at the edge of the ceiling with his head almost touching it. He also noticed that the height of the room had doubled at some point. Did this Gremmy do it immediately? Or had it been done at some point without him noticing? Regardless of the answer, he could see his target holding high up in the air, out of range of his normal means. There was another problem too. Looking around he could see that he was surrounded, every copy of Juvia in a form of pure water with attacks being charged up ready to strike before they all charged in at him. He understood exactly what Gremmy was making them do. He was reluctant to hurt them. And he wasn't even capable of killing them as things stood. If he made a barrier of ice, they would all freeze and die the second they made contact with it. If he lashed out with attacks, they would freeze them to death. Hell, in their current state they would probably all die just from coming close to him. Their previous attacks had done that, so he could see little reason that things wouldn't change just from them turning completely into water. No matter what he did, they would die. It would be like watching that demon killing them all over again without being able to do anything to stop them. He had been prepared to see that sight. Instead his vision shifted entirely as he blinked and found himself on the other end of the hall. His gaze immediately snapped to the side to see Mest releasing his grip on the back of his robe, the man letting out a wince as he looked at the palm of his hand. "Even your clothes are cold now. That power really isn't for show. Mest? How did you get in?" A hole appeared in the barrier at one point. "By the way, I wasn't the only one to come to help." The sound of cracking echoed through the room before the ceiling over the Juvia copies began to cave in, Mest immediately taking a position in front of Gray to block his sight. All Gray saw was large chunks of the roof beginning to fall as a gigantic fist of golden light broke through. Mest didn't move away until the whole scenery around them began to change. The entire ceiling had been removed, as had the walls and whatever had happened to all the copies of Juvia. The open sky greeted them once again as Gremmy took up higher and higher. Gray's eyes quickly moved around though to search for the source of the original attack, and yet all he could see was the giant fist, his eyes missing Mistoggen at first glance as he attempted to find the giant form of the man's legendary spell. "He can't use it fully in here," Mest quickly summarized. "The barrier would have the giant form hunched down too much and would make maneuverability impossible. And considering the speed it can move at with its usual size, he'd be a sitting duck in that form," Gray finished for Mest, watching as the golden light that made up the arm began to shrink down and return to Mistoggen, the golden aura around the man glowing brighter with the return of energy. "We heard from Kisuk about what's going on. Hibiki managed to contact him, though he said he was in a pretty bad state." "That's him," Gray said as he gestured towards where Kisuk lay. He didn't have to see the face Mest made to know what he was thinking. All the blood, along with the state of Kisuk's body, was not a welcoming sight to see. Gremmy did that to him with a thought. "He can do the same to you and Mistoggen too. Keep your distance and don't make yourself the true threat. Let him focus on me so he forgets about you too." "Will do," Mest replied as he quickly made a few signs towards Mistoggen. In the distance Mistoggen gave a brief nod before retreating back a few paces in the air, his spear being readied for use at a moment's notice. "You'll lead then? Want some help reaching Gremmy?" Gray shook his head. "No need. I have my own ways like this." Before Mest could even ask what it was, Gray had leapt up into the air. Even if he put all his strength into the jump, however, he knew he couldn't go too far. However, as he brought one foot down, ice formed beneath his feet, creating a platform beneath his solace for just a moment to press off from. It was obvious Gremmy hadn't expected for him to chase him up into the sky. He didn't blame the Quincy. There had been no records of him ever doing such a move. If anything, what he was attempting was similar to what Shinigami and Quincy did to fly around, only his platforms were bound by gravity and so only existed briefly. But even if he had to stay on the move like this, it still meant foes couldn't just escape into the air from him. He should have expected the job to not be easy, however. Right before his eyes he could see a mass amount of projectiles flying towards him, fired from magic snipers that all surrounded Gremmy. Quickly kicking off from a new platform, he dove to one side, his hand pressing against the air just in time to form another platform and to flip further off from it. With another kick off the air, he was moving up higher again, unwilling to let something like that stop him. The giant building he could see suddenly rushing towards him immediately made him realize how screwed he was. Even if he froze it, it would take time to get past and he would lose height. The method would be repeated in mass from there until he would be eventually caught and crushed underneath the weight of the debris. Luckily he had little to worry about when Mest appeared up above him, his scythe digging into the falling building as he placed his free hand against its surface. "Keep going." With a large cry of resistance from Mest, the entire building and mage vanished, reappearing as barely a dot in the distance from them. For Gray, though, he couldn't afford to get distracted, continuing to leap up towards Gremmy to finally reach a range he could attack from. Hundreds and hundreds of weapons must have suddenly become reality, however, as he had mere seconds to react before they all fired down at him, and this time his blood ribbons wouldn't be able to protect him. Instead he brought one hand up to his mouth and made a small hole with his thumb and index finger. "Why, I don't let you feel a chill as cold as my home," Gray muttered before letting out a stream of cold air through the gap. What might have been a small stream for him, however, quickly expanded out into a large cycle of snow and ice, freezing everything it came into contact with as it tore upwards towards Gremmy. Right before it could make contact, however, a large barrier of rock appeared before the Quincy. That moment of blindness for Gremmy was deadly however. What he could only see as a beam of light tore past him, forcing him to spin round to see Mistoggen higher above him with his spear ready to throw. Gremmy was immediately ready to destroy the weapon mid-flight in order to break the man's spirit only to hear the cracking sound from behind, realizing too late that Mistoggen himself had been nothing more than a distraction. A stream of blood shot out through the wall behind him and turned to the ice the moment it made contact with his back, and a moment later he was nothing more than a body encased in a large block of ice, falling from the sky and shattering when he finally hit the ground. Unfortunately it wasn't over for them. Not when yet another Gremmy stood even further above them, standing on the outside surface of the barrier. Before they could even think why, the entire barrier that surrounded the base vanished. You lot have been pests for too long now. I'll wipe you out entirely and leave no traces behind. Gray wanted to ask what he meant by that only for his answer to appear as the clouds began to part, a giant meteor forming in the sky above and slowly beginning its descent. He took one look at it before knowing he had no chance of taking that head-on and still reaching Gremmy. So instead he began to drop, rushing towards the ground as quickly as he could with Mistoggen on his heel. Gremmy himself made no moves to chase after them, his confidence in his victory too absolute to even consider that they could survive this. Reaching the ground, Gray stumbled to a halt as he took another look up, Mistoggen landing beside him. That's really not good, he muttered, seeing the meteor beginning to pick up speed. Won't that kill his own allies if it hits? I'm not sure he cares or not, Mistoggen muttered, a worried look appearing across his face before he turned to Mest as the man arrived back. Should I dash? No. That's even more dangerous. More dangerous than a meteor? I beg to differ. You do this and you'll regret it, Mest stated, his scythe being swung up threateningly. I'll contact Hibiki and get him to tell Ichigo to dash. Don't bother, Gray stated, staring up at the meteor. Yeah, I think this will work. May want to stand back. Stand back. Mest reluctantly did as the man wanted as Gray crouched down towards the ground, resting on his knees as the ribbons of blood around him dug into the ground in front of him in a massive circle. Clenching his hands together for a moment, Gray let his mind imagine exactly what he desired, his magical power building as he gathered the energy necessary. Then, with one swift move, he slammed his hands against the ground. Ice spread out from his palms towards the circle before it made contact with the edge, at which point what spread up was nothing but ice. The newly made giant pillar continued to stretch up higher and higher before finally slamming directly into the meteor, ice spreading across every surface it could in order to hold the meteor entirely with a frozen prison. Only when it was finally done did Gray lift his hands from the ground, snapping his fingers and having the entire structure shatter into tiny flakes of ice. As he made to stand however, he felt a blast of fire slam into him from behind and send him face first back into the ground. What had to be the equivalent to the weight of a house immediately landed on him, causing him to let out a cry of pain even as he tried to get to work with freezing all of it. Mest and Mistoggen charged immediately at Gremmy, now on the ground, only for them both to be sent flying back as blasts of wind, each as strong as the forces of a hurricane, slammed into them. Before he could deal any killing blows however, Kisuke was there, his sword swinging and severing Gremmy's head from his shoulders. Gray could only stare in shock at the sight for a moment as the weight on top of him finally shattered into pieces of ice, disbelief etched across his face. How dash? Be careful. Gremmy is still here. But how? How are you fine? He lost focus, Kisuke stated simply. Gremmy needs to focus to keep his will enforced on the world. You lot distracted him so much that he forget entirely about me, resulting in me being returned to my original state. It appears even such powerful magic has its limitations. I don't think that helps too much however, stated Mest with a groan, clutching his ribs as he tried to ignore the pain from being flung away. The others quickly followed his gaze however to find 10 Gremmys before them, each with the same sinister look across their faces. Any idea how we can deal with them? You can't. All the Gremmys stated at once. We are unstoppable. If one cannot do the task, we simply need another to share the load. Our numbers are endless. Our power has no limit. No matter how hard you struggle, your fate is already visible in my mind. And I shall enforce it on the world for all time. Any ideas? Miss Doggin asked desperately, but none of them had any. Against this man, versions of the same man, a man who was not made any weaker by making more copies of himself, there was no solution visible. In the eyes of a lot of them, it was all over. Until a silver arrow shot through the sky and slammed into the lead Gremmy's chest. All of them, even the copies of Grammy, stared at the sight in shock before being drawn towards its source. Slowly lowered a bow, the man in question simply ensured his glasses were on correctly as he walked towards them. You all did well to fight such a foe. A being such as this is extremely deadly. Who are you? Gray asked, an expression mirrored by most of those there. Grammy was not one of them. It's you, one of the copies of Grammy muttered, disbelief evident in his voice. The inheritor of the title of the last Quincy. Ryukin Ishida. Protector of the fairies. Failure of goals. Ryukin Ishida, Grammy stated, each copy around him glaring at the man in question. Just what is a hermit like yourself doing at His Majesty's palace? I thought you would have known your place and would have stayed far away from these beautiful, marble halls. Beautiful? Is that how you see this place? Ryukin spared a glance around before shaking his head. As I expected. This place is far from the site it was many years ago. I still remember visiting it briefly after I lost my wife. It was nothing more than ruins back then. And yet a few years later it became this, as impressive as many must have viewed it in its prime. To me though, it's just a pathetic attempt to relive past days of glory. Why whack truly is pathetic. You dare insult His Majesty in front of me? Yes, Ryukin replied uncaringly. I don't care much for the affairs of magic. It causes people nothing but pain and cheapens the success of people when there are such easy shortcuts to be taken. And Wywak is the most sickening of all mages, believing he can control all aspects of reality and never make a mistake. What else would I call such arrogance but pathetic? None of the Gremmys said anything, but all of the mages of Ishgar present could see his anger was barely being held in check. And yet for many, they noticed that Grammy was still reluctant to strike. As if afraid to proceed forward carelessly. You know, I heard the title of the last Quincy before, Kisuk spoke up, directing his words towards Ryukin much to the man's displeasure. Apparently legends that involve it speak of a Quincy that shall bring about an end. Is that true? Legends, myths, rumors, they all end up built from baseless tales of misguided individuals. But I suppose there is some truth to it, admitted Ryukin with displeasure as he reached into his coat and pulled out a large Quincy cross, held by a long chain. I'm not the first to own the title of the last Quincy. I possess a script that I inherited from my father, passed down from his. The only script in existence that is passed on entirely, and with it all the knowledge of its past wielders. So I've gained enough memories from the past to be aware of the events that spawned these legends. The very existence of a power known as the last Quincy is in itself proof to the eventual result, even if that won't occur in my lifetime. What that end will be and when it will occur I cannot say, Ryukin added reluctantly. Will it be today? Tomorrow? Decades or centuries from now? Maybe it has already begun. Will it be caused by my actions directly or the decisions I make spiraling out? All that is clear is that eventually one possessing the title of the last Quincy will bring about a result that leaves them as the last of their kind. One day, maybe one day soon or maybe one day far away from now, there will be only one Quincy left. And it will be the one holding this title, not Wywak. Not if I stop you here though, Grammy stated, confidence swelling in his voice. Why don't I just imagine your existence to end? I'll end that cursed power right now before it can even pose a chance of harming His Majesty. Now D-. Are you sure you should be doing that in your condition? Asked Ryukin, one hand raised and pointing towards the Grammy speaking. Haven't you noticed it yet? I'm surprised you haven't noticed the taste of it in your mouth. You're bleeding. Pausing before he could strike, every combo of Grammy frowned as they raised a hand towards their lips. As he pulled his hand away, he noticed it was now dyed a new color. Red. That's impossible, Grammy muttered, feeling the blood rising in his throat and dribbling down through the corners of his mouth. What have you? You're finally afraid. You should be. You really should learn to count, since maybe then you would remember something. One of you has already been shot. The eyes of every Gremmy snapped to the center of their forces, all locking onto the Gremmy at their head. Without realizing it, they had missed when that Gremmy had fallen to his knees, clutching his chest in pain and at the silver arrow sticking out through his chest. I understand that I was a big threat in your eyes, but to forget about your own self? Sloppy. What have you done? All other copies of Gremmy screamed at him, demanding answers to their confusion. Tell me, Ishida. It's simple, Ryukin replied calmly as he removed his glasses, taking the time to wipe them to show how little he had to fear from them. I shot him. Pausing, he glanced up and added, are you confused about your own state? Or his? What you really should ask is what that arrow is. It's just silver. Quincy do not have a weakness to silver. Is that what you imagine the arrow to be? The mere fact it doesn't change to reflect that should be an indication of its real power. This arrow has one purpose and one purpose only. To kill Quincy. Kill Quincy? Muttered Gray in disbelief. How? That's just a normal arrow, right? If I shot you with it, yes, replied Ryukin, annoyed at the interruption. But against a Quincy, this arrow is like poison. The knowledge of how to make it has been passed down through generations until this point, improving upon every iteration to create the greatest Quincy killing weapon in existence. It doesn't matter how strong the Quincy is nor how great their power is. In the face of this arrow, it all crumbles down. You can feel it, can't you, Quincy? Ryukin added as he returned his focus towards Gremmy. The feeling of the raw magic systematically tearing through your body, ripping away every obstacle in its path and targeting your own magic directly. Can you really maintain this imagination of yours over reality with how quickly your power is dropping? There's still more than one of us, Gremmy argued. You only shot one of us. Look at yourself and tell me, do I really need any more than that? Ryukin asked. The effects should be starting to kick in. Even if every copy of yourself is equal in this world, they still share one crucial aspect. Your power of imagination, enhanced by each copy and shared amongst yourselves. The arrow's power isn't going to be nearly satisfied with just one of you. It'll feast on every last copy of your existence. Gremmy tried to scream out words of defiance only to suddenly feel pain tearing through his chest. There was no wound on his chest, but he still felt energy tearing into his body, ripping it apart from the inside as his form began to slip away. After a few moments there was only one Gremmy standing there. The one originally shot. This can't be my end. Trying to pull the arrow from his chest, Gremmy only succeeded in causing himself more pain the second his hands came into contact with the arrow. Damn you! Damn you, last Quincy! I swear on the name of His Majesty. I shall have my rev dash. An arrow slammed into his head before he could finish his words, Ryukin lowering his bow in annoyance. If you're going to die, then hurry up and do it. I'm tired of listening to your arrogance. Watching the body, he observed as the silver arrow began to break apart into motes of energy, floating up into the sky as the last remnants of Gremmy's power began to unravel. The very ground around them began to age, the complex that had been in pristine condition degrading until it was nothing but ruins around them, beaten down through 400 years of solitude. And where Gremmy had stood there was nothing more than a brain, lying motionless on the ground. Well, it looked like your bluff worked, stated Kisuk, his hands clapping in celebration. Excellent work, Mr. Ishida. Wait, bluff? Asked Miss Doggen in confusion. Are we talking about the same thing? You saw the effect that Silver Arrow had on that Quincy, right? No, it was a bluff, Ryukin stated without any shame. I knew that as it stood, normal means would not kill Gremmy permanently. So long as he believes he can win, he will eventually do so. And while that arrow would kill any copy of Gremmy that it hit, the same would not be said for the other copies. All that talk about them being connected and the arrow's power devouring them all was just words, made up to sell the story. But they died, pointed out Mest. Surely it did work as you said it would. The situation played out like that because Gremmy himself was imagining it occurring like that. I tricked him into using his own power against himself, first by pointing out blood that wasn't there to make his mind doubt his reality, followed by the eventual shock of the Quincy arrow coupled with the fear he felt from my title. At that point, he laid the seeds for his own undoing and imagined himself dying because he couldn't completely shake away the doubts he felt from my words. Looking at the remains of Gremmy, Ryukin let out a sigh. It's a shame though. That arrow was not meant for him. But I had little choice. Wywak could not be allowed to obtain that power. Without that arrow to finish the job, even if you all killed him, the power he possesses would only go to Wywak and strengthen him further. Speaking of which, we should move to leave. I fear things are taking a turn for the worse. What makes you say that? Gray asked, letting his power slowly drop as his form changed back to normal from his Aetherius form. Sense something. Of sorts. Wywaka's power just spiked, and at the same time Ichigo's just plummeted. We all need to be ready to run because this assault of yours is about to have the tide turned against you if we don't leave now. Protector of the Fairies. Ichigo. An arrow slammed into Uriu's path before he could take more than a step, Wywak sighing at him in disappointment as he reached up and grabbed one of the arrows around him. Honestly Uriu, you've turned into such a disappointment. Your plans are all falling apart around you and you're losing yourself to pesky emotions such as concern for others. Such emotions are fine, but you should not allow them to compromise your actions like you are about to. How? Uriu growled out, staring at the form of Wywak with unrestrained hatred. How did you do it? We took your power. We just killed you. Did you? Wywak sighed before tapping the side of his head with the arrow he was holding. I suppose that can be considered true in a certain sense, but why don't you think a bit more? Go ahead, I won't strike. How do I know you aren't lying? If you can't answer that, you've been wasting your time pretending to be my ally for all these years. As much as it pained him to admit it, Wywak was right here. Wywak wasn't lying. The man hated lies above all else and never had told a single one from what he had seen. And when Wywak said something so straightforward like this, there were no hidden meanings. Wywak really wanted him to look at the power he obtained. It couldn't hurt to do so, he supposed. The fact he had something new in the all was a sign that he and Ichigo had succeeded like they had with Giselle, but that was still different. Especially because Wywak was currently at their feet and in front of him. Reaching into the library of his power that contained all the things he had learned, he found what he was looking for rather easily. Memories briefly flowed through him, disjointed and out of sync. It was only then that he realized that wasn't a side effect of absorbing the memories with the power, but rather the very nature of the memories he was seeing. They belonged to the power he had absorbed, and yet at the same time they didn't. Then there was the power. He reached for it, instantly gaining a complete understanding of the power it was through the memories of the one he had taken it from. That was when he saw the truth, and it was then when he could only look towards the body in fear. This form. It's wrong. His hand reached out towards it, touching the skin for a moment, before he swiped away, using the new power he obtained as he did so. Flesh was morphed as his hand traced across the surface of the skin, the body of Wywak at his feet changing into a bald man with a third eye in the center of his forehead. Lloyd and Royd. They were born as twins and by a strange stroke of luck were born with a mental connection to one another. When they awoke a script, one became two within them. The yourself. They gained a shared power, with both being capable of taking on the form of an individual. Lloyd would take it further and copy their power and techniques, while Royd would gain their memories and personality. You know this all, of course, Wywak stated, but I thought it was such a waste that this power was split in such a way. They had their uses like this, but as soldiers their full power was inferior to most. What good is memories if you lack the strength to make them useful? What use is power if you lack the knowledge of how the original user best made use of it in their body? And then I discovered it after I infused them with some of my blood. Their connection was strengthened, and in Volstandig their forms fused together into one to utilize the best of both. You created a fake version of yourself, Uriu muttered in shock. One that we were fighting all this time. But the magic. It reacted perfectly around them. That's not something they should be able to replicate. Magic would see the difference. Indeed. So I did have to do a bit of acting from the sidelines while I hid, ensuring the illusion was kept up. Was that possible? To manipulate magic to such a degree that it could even make someone look like Hanukkah to the eyes of others? If anyone could pull it off, it had to be Wywak. He couldn't doubt the skill the man had with his control over magic. "I'll admit, staying in the shadows like this wasn't my original intentions," Wywak added as he glanced at the fused form of the twins. "But I see now that my suspicions paid off. After Giselle came back empty to me, I knew that it meant something had happened to her in such a way that it had bypassed her power and stolen it away. I could have easily been wrong, but I decided to bet on the chance that you were involved. And look. It appears I was right. Such a shame you wasted all that effort on stealing the power of a fake." Releasing his grip on the arrow, Wywak let it turn towards Uriah threateningly. "And now I suppose I should return the favor. I gave you a chance, Uriah. You could have been the prince of an empire. But now? You'll simply be another stepping stone on the road to peace." "A stepping stone?" Uriah muttered quietly. "Yes, I suppose that is all we are to you. What our lives mean to you. What my mother's life meant to you." "I'm sorry, I didn't catch that." "I said so, that's what my mother's life meant to you." Uriah screamed, his Volstandig bursting back to life around his body and an abyss break arrow forming in his fingers. Despite the large release of power, however, Wywak didn't show the slightest bit of fear from the attack as Uriah drew the arrow back against his bow. "Uriah, the time for childish tricks is over. It won't stop me anymore now that I don't want it to." Uriah didn't care, firing the arrow straight at Wywak. The man merely caught it mid-flight by the arrowhead, a burst of magic surrounding the arrowhead before Uriah could react and containing the deadly energy within a tiny sphere. Despite Uriah's best attempts to cause the energy to detonate, his will couldn't reach the arrow. What little connection he had to the energy was severed the moment Wywak did what he did. Looking at the ball he now held in his hands, Wywak tossed it up a few times before throwing it forward, the energy unraveling as he did so and giving Uriah only a fraction of a second to think of a plan to survive the blast. Abyss break tore through the area where he stood, but the energy was immediately swatted away with the swing of Ichigo's palm. Wywak's eyes briefly glanced towards where Ichigo was next to him before looking back at the other Ichigo. "Ah, you already got used to their power, have you? Impressive." Before Uriah could even react, Wywak was right before him. "But can you even utilize that power well enough?" Uriah was instantly out of range the moment Wywak tried to follow up with a strike. He could feel the memories of how to use this power following through his mind, Ichigo's form helping him handle the power. But already he could feel tremendous strain on his body. He should have realized that Ichigo was only able to maintain such levels of power so easily because he was supported by the world like Olukin were. To replace all that lost energy that could be drawn in, he was having to substitute most of the magic he had left. But what choice did he have? He needed the form of someone strong, and so he had instinctively fallen back onto Ichigo for that assistance. Because as much as he hated to admit it, without Ichigo here to back him up, his own skills were lacking too much to be a viable threat to Wywak. But with Ichigo's, he had a chance. It would be brief, but with the speed he could utilize, he could do it. With that in mind, he made to move and charge at Wywak. The man hadn't even turned towards him yet, so this would be easier than anything else in his life. And yet his body didn't move. It wouldn't respond. It just stayed as it was, locked up as pain flooded his body. "You shouldn't have tried to copy someone so strong like that," Wywak stated as he finally turned towards him. "The power you're using copies many things. But when it comes to the body, it only copies the appearance. Unless your body is strong enough to support the new power you gain, it's useless. You can manage in the case of someone a bit stronger than you, sometimes even if they are a lot stronger. But you're trying to copy Ichigo and utilize his power as he does, even if it's only a Shikai state. And so your body is experiencing the weight of all that power on every joint, begging to be freed from such abuse. Should I help?" Uriah released the form before Wywak could make a move, darting back as he tried to put more distance between the two of them. It made little difference when Wywak appeared right before him, one hand gripping him by the throat before slamming him into the ground. Quickly reaching to the tubes he had held by his belt, Uriah tried to grab one only for pain to fill his body instead, Wywak's hand halfway through his chest. The wound was just like the one inflicted on Ichigo. It wasn't physical but rather spiritual. He could feel Wywak reaching for the power that was once his, and he knew he had only seconds to do anything to stop him. A few moments later, Wywak pulled his hand back out, a brief bit of confusion entering his mind as he looked at his hand. Interesting. You purged the whole contents of the all before I could extract it. I wasn't even aware that was possible. You really did not want Giselle's power to fall into my hands, it appears. But it matters little now. I have what I need. He really did. Uriah released in horror, especially with what he felt from Wywak now. It wasn't like the man's magical power had risen, nor had it dropped. It was more like a quality was now present in it, one that he could see through the flickers of the sight he was currently losing with the fragment of power gone. None noticed as the compound aged all around them because such events were second in their mind to what was before them. Victory for one, and utter devastation for the other. Protector of the fairies. Is that all you've got? Gildarts roared, sending Jugram flying back with a wave of crash magic from his leg as he leapt into the air. The force was enough that Jugram had no choice but to bring up his sword to block the blow as he was sent flying back, cracks forming across its surface and onto his sword arm. With a small tap against his shield, every drop of damage was transferred away to the shield and pushed back towards Gildarts. None of it settled, however. Gildarts landed roughly back on his foot, burst of crash magic being expelled from the stumps of his arms as he tried to stabilize his body on one foot. And yet he had very little damage on his body besides small scars and cuts, wounds gained from the small injuries Jugram had obtained through the holes in his guard. Without wasting a moment, Jugram rushed back in, moving far faster than Gildarts could. His sword swung, but Gildarts still succeeded in dodging, ducking beneath the blow as he altered the forces of crash magic he emitted to throw off his movements from Jugram's predictions. Before another strike could be brought down on him, Jugram was forced to brace himself as a loud burst of energy slammed into him and sent him flying back. The damage was gone moments later, however, and this time Gildarts gained the injuries from his opponent. His face scrunched up in pain as a painful ringing sounded in his ears, almost disrupting his balance as he tried to straighten himself back up. Falling on the ground right now would be the death of him. He was honestly lucky to have survived this long. He had originally hoped a show of force would have been enough to make Jugram fall back and regroup. But of all the Quincy he had to be fighting, he had to get the one who was claiming to be the second in command to Wywak himself. His luck was always terrible. To lose one arm and leg, and then later lose the other arm, to being captured and finally this. He liked to think though that it was what was saving him from Jugram's script, that his bad luck was finally bringing some good fortune to him, but he knew that wasn't the case. It was actually much simpler now that he had realized the trick. Jugram reflected the damage back with the shield along with using his script's primary power to first put the opponent in an equal state. It truly did attempt to equal the scales, and then the shield was Jugram's way of completely tipping them in his favor like a dealer stacking the deck. But that damage, both shared and reflected, seemed to obey one simple rule that he cared about, and he had found this out all through trial and error. The damage was always placed in the same locations that it was caused. It was what made him aim his strikes as best as he could. He had no arms and only one leg. That made those areas completely safe to be harmed because Jugram couldn't inflict anything on him from those areas when there was nothing there to be harmed. The scales had already been tipped in Jugram's favor before he even used his script, so he couldn't be affected in the same way as others could be. That led to one big discovery. The shield. He had seen it crack when damage was put into it, and those cracks remained even when the damage was then reflected. It was obvious that the shield was not something that could be healed like Jugram's body, and so held signs of that damage. It was also why he had never seen the man block a strike with his shield. If he could have repaired it, then there would be nothing to fear of using it to block strikes. If anything, it would be better to use it. But the very fact he didn't meant the shield could only take so much damage and that it wasn't replaceable, or at least not in battle. And what was even more prominent was that it wasn't grievous injuries or large wounds that caused the shield to crack more here. It was the wounds to the arms and leg that he lacked. The shield reflected the damage onto the enemy normally, but he could only assume that it wasn't able to do so correctly with his missing limbs interfering in the process. And the result was that the pain and injuries, the misfortune, held within was unable to escape and so accumulated within permanently, causing more strain to the shield over time so long as it had nowhere to go quickly. And when the shield breaks, there would be no reversing those injuries any further. Still, such an advantage was wasted on him. He had survived this long because he had been forced to be very creative. It was hard to hit an opponent who moved erratically. They are difficult to predict, and so he had utilized his crash magic to simulate such actions, allowing his unstable form to move unpredictably in both attacking and dodging. But it was only a matter of time until Jagram fully adjusted, and then used his superior speed to cut him down, or until he ran out of magic. He had a lot, but utilizing so much crash magic constantly like this was taking its toll on his body. And to even utilize it so freely, he had been forced to release any restraints he kept on his magical power, the result only further requiring more magic to be spent. As it stood, he maybe had a minute or two left of constant use. Maybe even less if he got more creative. Were there any other tricks he could think of? One was working fairly well, and it appeared Jagram had yet to realize the secret behind it. But it was no finishing move. Maybe, just maybe, he might be able to make something he had been working on work. Though if he missed, it would be pretty much over. He didn't have anywhere near enough magic to use this more than once. "All right," he muttered, turning his head slightly and glancing out of the corner of his eyes towards the two girls behind him. Kelia had her back to him, but he could see the slight glow of her magic over Wendy's body. If the worst happened, he would have to leave it in their hands, as much as he hated to do so. But he could worry about that if he lost. And he wasn't quite ready to accept that yet. "Let's go then." Lifting the heel of his foot from the ground as he began to tilt forward, he instantly released a burst of crash magic from the sole of his foot. The result sent him rocketing towards Jagram, barely managing to keep himself stable in flight. Jagram's sword immediately came up to slash at him, but a burst of crash magic from his left side had him dodging it by a hair's breadth, his foot catching the ground and almost slipping as it hit the surface. He spun on it as fast as he could, but he could see Jagram had recovered faster, his sword swinging at him too fast to be avoided. Instead, Gildarts did the only thing he could. His mouth opened for a moment before he slammed his teeth together, releasing what little power he could release from the action. The best he could compare it to was sound magic. He was essentially trying to utilize smaller waves of crash magic in order to both disrupt Jagram and send the man flying. It wasn't as effective as he would have liked, even though it did send Jagram flying back into where Estelle had been before Kelia and Wendy's battle. Releasing crash magic like this was difficult enough when he just considered gathering the magic and releasing it, and it became even harder when he also had to ensure that he only released the force forward. If he got the directions even slightly wrong, he could end up releasing crash magic within his own head, and first-hand experience had shown him how dangerous crash magic could be. The result of this all meant that his attack lacked a lot of raw power to it. Sure, it had a lot of force behind it, it was able to save his skin countless times so far because of that, but the damage it inflicted was minor at best. And most of the time it was more of an annoyance to deal with for him when the attack was inevitably reflected back at him. Still, it hadn't been rendered useless yet, so that was something. Trying not to waste the chance he had, seeing Jagram with his back to the wall, he leapt forward, preparing to utilize his trump card. That attempt was cut short instantly when he saw Jagram vanish before his eyes, knowing immediately what was coming. He kicked up with his foot and released crash magic from it the moment it came face to face with where Jagram had been, the force sending him flying backwards and narrowly avoiding death from the sword that stabbed down from above where he had been. He didn't have time to stop himself when he slammed into the wall behind him, however, the stone crumbling almost instantly on contact with his body. With how much punishment it had taken from previous fights, the brief exposure to the raw magical power around him was simply too much for it to handle. Luckily, he managed to get his foot squarely on the ground before he could fall, charging right back at Jagram before the Quincy could have a chance to make another move. He saw the Quincy show him an annoyed look before disappearing from his sight once more, Gildarts immediately moving to dodge. His actions, however, appeared to be entirely unnecessary, his gaze shifting from the nearby areas that he expected the attacks to come from to further places. It was then that he saw it. Jagram with his sword raised up, right behind Kelia and preparing to strike down at the two girls beneath him. "Oh no, you don't!" he roared, firing as much magic he could spare into his foot and sending himself rocketing towards Jagram's exposed back. This was going to be it. All or nothing. He couldn't afford to wait with the lives of those two in the balance. It was obviously a trap, and his suspicions turned out to be correct when he saw Jagram immediately spin round to face him. But that didn't matter, not did the slashing sword coming down at him. In his eyes, he couldn't see that sword stopping him now. Every last drop of magic that he could summon answered his call, all being forced towards where his right arm had been. And as each drop of magic joined the rest, a shape took form. An arm of pure destructive force, made up of raw crash magic focused and compressed so heavily into a familiar shape that he could control. He could feel immense pain tearing at what remained of his original limb, the energy unstable and even lashing out at him, but the force he could feel striking him only filled him with confidence. With one strike he would ensure that Jugram was unable to recover from the blast. His fist of magic swung and the sword coming down at it shattered a third of the way up from the guard. The rest of the metal was reduced to nothing but dust the second it made contact with his arm, his fist continuing on and slamming straight into Jugram's chest. With one attack the Quincy was sent flying back like an arrow, slamming into the furthest wall and breaking through it to hit even more. With that one attack spent, Gildarts felt what little control he had on his magic slip. The crash magic around his body faded entirely and the newly made arm vanished into the air. He couldn't stop himself when he fell onto his back, unable to balance his body and further without the use of magic to stabilize it. None of that concerned him however as he strained his neck to look towards the dark hole he had sent Jugram through. Had he done it? Had that been enough? He didn't hear anything coming from the hole, nor did he see anything. After what was a minute of patient waiting, he slowly began to allow a smile appear across his face, preparing to laugh with joy. Those feelings were instantly crushed by the sounds he heard however, a single footstep being heard from within the hole. Straining his neck further to peer closer towards the hole, every thought he had begun to fill with dread, reinforced every time he heard another footstep. Finally he saw Jugram appear. The man's chest was ruined, he could see it clearly even when the man was still half in the darkness. And the more the Quincy stepped out, the more horrific the injuries he could see on the Quincy. His crash magic hadn't quite made a hole straight through the man's chest but it had certainly cleared away most of what was in its path, everything that had been present now missing and leaving an empty hole in its place. He had missed. That was the first thought that entered his head as he began to think rationally again. He had intended to aim for the heart but had instead wound up hitting lower. Or perhaps that had been Jugram's last-ditch attempt at avoiding the strike, doing whatever he could to at least survive. "Do you like what you see?" Jugram asked, his voice weak as he spoke. From the way Jugram struggled to walk, he could tell that the Quincy was in great pain. "I suppose you must be already wondering why I have yet to reverse this." He'd admit the thought was crossing his mind but he had an idea. The second those injuries hit him, he'd die. He was already too weak with his current state and would stand no chance like that. "Well, it's rather simple," Jugram elaborated. "I wanted you to see what you managed to do first. You should be proud. You managed to wound me to such a degree that I didn't think possible in your state. I see now that the praise His Majesty had for your skills was no mere exaggeration. No, it may have very well been underestimating your true power. If you had been at your best, in prime condition rather than what you have been reduced to, you very may have won even with the disadvantages you would have gained. But alas, your troublesome attempts at fighting it finally at an end. You have nothing left to spend. And so I think now I can share something with you. Would you like to know a little secret behind my shield before your death?" Gildarts didn't say anything but he guessed he didn't need to when Jugram continued to explain anyway. "I can tell you worked out the truth behind it. When you tried to aim for areas you lacked or tried to force me to block so that the injured parts of me were always the ones you lacked. A smart tactic, and it certainly pushed my shield to the limit. The truth is, my shield cannot hold in much damage as a whole. I can store a significant amount within it, that certainly is true, but that hit its limit long into my fight with you. After that, it simply begins to break under its own strain. Why do you think I kept aiming for those areas?" Gildarts taunted, enjoying the brief look of annoyance that appeared across Jugram's face. "You can't reflect them back at me so it was easy to take advantage of." "True, I cannot reflect it back at you. But I think you are mistaken about one thing. Did you know that the shield reflects back damage?" "Of course I know that dash." "Did you know the shield reflects back damage?" "What?" "I said I already dash." "Did you know that the shield reflects back damage?" I said I dash. This time he cut himself off, the words sending warning bells through his mind. Seeing his expression, Jugram's expression morphed into one of pure enjoyment found only through arrogance felt by victors. That's right. You are starting to listen. He struggled forward, hobbling at times as he drew closer. My shield reflects damage. Whatever damage I take, I pour it away from me into the shield and then it gets reflected away from its surface. Normally I guess that energy would be dispersed into the air around us and would likely cause very tiny amounts of damage to everyone it encounters miles away. Nothing more than a tiny little poke at such distances with how widespread the misfortune would become. Finally coming to a stop, Jugram looked down at Gildarts from beside Kelia. But did you forget? You aren't fighting here alone. Ice filled Gildart's veins, his gaze shifting entirely from Jugram to Kelia and Wendy. No. Why don't you turn and face him, Stray? Jugram said as he turned towards Kelia, the Godslayer shaking her head. Oh, now don't be shy, he added as he forcefully grabbed her by her head with his left hand, lifting her up by her hair even as she tried to rip his hand away. She succeeded, but not until he had forced her away from Wendy and to face Gildarts' eyes. That was when he saw it. Wounds covered her body, all focused around her arms and one leg. He knew just from looking that they were from every injury he had inflicted on Jugram since his fight had begun. She realized, Jugram added, enjoying the dread he saw on Gildarts' face. It's why she made sure to always have her back to you. Why she made sure that she always had her back to me and kept that Sky Priestess out of the way. So that any damage I reflected away hit her and not her patient. Kelia. Gildarts muttered in horror. Looking closely at the wounds he could see they were healing, the girl's regeneration acting to heal every injury she took, but even if they had healed she still must have been feeling every bit of pain he had inflicted on Jugram. Many of those wounds had been intending to cripple Jugram even. And yet she had suffered through it without a word, her hands never stopping from healing Wendy even as they must have shook from pain. Somehow he couldn't even find the words to apologize. Even if this had happened because of Jugram, it was him who dealt the damage originally. And he hadn't even noticed anything at all when he checked on her. What good would words do now? It's all right, Kelia said softly towards him, her eyes showing understanding as she spoke. I didn't tell you because you wouldn't be able to fight seriously if you knew. I couldn't add another burden on your shoulders. Such lovely words, Jugram stated before he swung out with his fist, swatting Kelia away and having her slam against the ground a few meters away. Now then, I suppose it's only fair to share the misfortune. I see no reason to give all this back to a cripple who will pretty much keel over whether I do anything or not. Nor do I see it useful to waste this misfortune on one who will only recover from it due to her endless good fortune. So why don't we give it to the last one left? Don't you dare! Gildarts roared as he tried to move. He was stopped before his head could even lift up from the ground by a food, Jugram pinning him to the ground by his head. Oh no you don't. Watch, why don't you? You did this attack. One strong enough, it almost won it all for you. Now both of you watch as it gets inflicted on the girl you were desperately trying to save. No. Don't. Screamed Kelia, struggling to her feet as she summoned magic to her hands. It was too late, however. The shield was already pointed at Wendy. All it needed was a touch from Jugram, and the second his hand hit the cracked metal a scream filled the air. The scream of a young girl. Protector of the fairies. The impossible power of a small girl. Where was he? He didn't know, nor could he see anything. All he saw was darkness that coated everything as he fell, submerging into a lake of nothingness. What was his name? He could see it, but it was fuzzy, and the moment he tried to reach for it the world changed. He was in a small house, surrounded by two adults looking at him lovingly. Then the image flashed and their faces were distorted and replaced, scorn and hate directed at him from the new faces. The image faded again and he could see two girls who felt important to him. A moment later and two became one, a boy's face who he couldn't quite make out and yet filled him with so much happiness. Were these his memories? He wasn't sure, nor did he care. He just let himself fall further into the memories, years passing before his eyes. He was training with an odd man with a cane, blocking strike after strike with a blade of his own. He was crawling through caves, trying to find the rumored treasure he had heard of that currently captivated his hopes. He was traveling to a town and found a guild of joy. He was searching through countless tomes of knowledge, desperate for even a snippet of hope to guide him. He was hanging out with an older boy and a younger girl, going on countless adventures. He was climbing up a cliff face, small fists slamming against the door of the house above. He wasn't sure why that memory seemed to resonate with him. He couldn't tell if it was his or not, but he could feel something from the sight of the building. A constant in the flow of memories he couldn't unravel. The door opened and a familiar man came into view. He knew the man's name. Aoesu Nimeya, a man who forges blades/miracles. He felt himself frown. Blades? Miracles? Which was correct? It was like two minds had spoken at once inside his head, each seeing the man in a different light. What do you want? He heard the man say, an annoyed look on his face. I told you, I'm not going to solve your little dragon problem. I'll make you a weapon if any of you want to try and fight, but otherwise you're on your own. It's not my problem. Hold on, he found himself saying, speaking in a voice he knew sounded too young to be his. I need your help. I told you, kid dash. I need you to make me something. Those words seemed to make the older man pause, tilting his head as he considered the matter. All right, you've got my attention. What do you need? If it's not interesting enough, I'm kicking you off that cliff. I need something that can allow me to manipulate life. He could tell that wasn't an answer Aoesu wanted to hear, the man sighing in annoyance as he began to shut the door. Get lost, kid. This is me being nice. Wait. He screamed, forcing his hands in the way of the door just as it slammed shut. For some reason he couldn't explain what he saw, and yet it felt right. There was pain, but he didn't feel worried about himself. If anything, any worry he felt was towards another. Please. The door opened a crack, and that was enough for the pressure to be released from the hands. Any damage on them was gone in the blink of an eye, as if it had never occurred. No sooner was it gone was the door flung completely open, almost hitting him as he scrambled back away from it. That's an interesting ability you have, Aoesu stated quietly, looking at him differently now. Almost like he saw a challenge before him. Kid, you can't die, can you? What? How did you dash? So that was it, Aoesu muttered, almost as if he was lost in another world. I wondered what was up. I've never seen someone so loved. Loved? Why did he heard so much disdain in his own voice? You heard me. Wonder why magic loves you so much, kid. Taking a step back, Aoesu gestured inside to his house. Well, might as well come in. From that little show, I can tell you at least have some ability to manipulate the forces of life and death. So long as you can do that, you'll be able to use whatever I make. So tell me what it is you need exactly and we'll see what I can make. The memory faded to black and he found more flashing before his eyes. A trial, a demon, a lab, they all seemed familiar to him. Then there was the other set, filled with running and desperation and yet so much joy and anticipation. Why was he running so quickly? Why was he so happy to be going somewhere? He wanted to know, and he even felt his hand reaching out towards the memories as if to grab hold onto them. Ichigo. A hand grasped his own before he could, and suddenly the darkness was replaced by pure light. The darkness had retreated away, replaced with a sky filled with golden light and structures made of towering glass, stretching out into the horizon on their sides. Most of the glass was shattered, however, pieces floating all around the endless world they were in. The name he heard ring in his head as he tried to make sense of it. Ichigo, yes, that was him. That was his name. He was Ichigo Dra Screech. He shook his head rapidly as the noise tore through his mind, shaking away any lingering memories. Kurosaki. That was the name he wanted. Ichigo Kurosaki. Slowly he could feel his mind setting once again, some of the glass around him settling back into place. He was a mage of fairy tale. A hybrid. A Nukin. Each thought helped quell the storm in his mind until he could think clearly once again, the world around him beginning to repair itself. His gaze locked onto the man who had snapped him out of that darkness, however, the old man he was familiar with, looking down at him with set eyes through his broken shades. Old man. What happened? The old man let out a sad sigh as he turned his head away, looking out into the distance at the world around him. You failed. Waiwak took back his power. My power. Raising a hand up to his chest, the old man took a look at it as its form began to flicker. Zanjitsu. What's happening? The old man ignored him, turning his gaze back to the world around him as he let out another sigh. I first thought this world was a lonely place when I first ended up here. But I knew you were always there, even if you weren't really here, so that never bothered me. All I needed was you, and I was once convinced that all you needed was me to protect you. I was happy. The old man's hand slowly clenched around his cloak, tightening his grip as frustration leaked into his voice. I wanted to stay here forever. Even when it became more crowded. Even when things got bad and this world started to drown in rain. If I could have stayed here forever. The old man finally turned his gaze back towards Ichigo, tears falling from the man's eyes. Nothing would have ever made me happier. Zanjitsu. What are you talking about? Pushing himself to his feet, Ichigo held out a hand to the man when he managed to stand. You're a part of me. You're not going to be able to run away that easily, he joked, giving a smile towards the old man. The old man tried to smile in turn, but it only showed how torn up he was. For everything I once did. My selfishness that once made you suffer. I apologized, but I don't ever think I showed how much I truly regret what I did. I could have lost your trust forever. I feared I would have. And yet you still accepted me. You let me stay when another might have cast me out. I know that the one I came from, Waiwak, would have thrown me away without a second thought if I had betrayed him in such a way. Your trust in me. No, your faith in me was what changed me. What made me desire to protect you even when faced with my own self. And yet in the end, I fear I may very well have led you to ruin. Don't say that, Zanjitsu, Ichigo replied, taking his stretched out hand and grabbing the old man by his shoulder reassuringly. You just rest for now. I won't let any of us die here, so conserve your strength. We can talk more later, all right? The old man paused, hesitating on what to say before finally nodding. You're right. Forgive me for rambling on so much. Wake back up and do what you need to do. We can talk more once the danger has passed. Ichigo gave him a nod before he vanished from the world around them, and the old man knew that, right now, Ichigo was reawakening in the real world outside. His gaze swiftly fell back to his hand, watching it flicker between its shape and nothing once again. You're fading away, he heard a voice say, turning his head over his shoulder to see the one who had originally claimed the name of Zanjitsu. The Hollow had no words to taunt him with right now though, nor even any aggression to show. Instead he just looked confused, as if unsure whether he should show true sadness or not care about the sight before him. You of all people. Why? I may have fused with Ichigo's Quincy powers, but I was once a part of Waiwak. Waiwak has claimed what was once his, and now I feel my power slipping away, not nearly enough to maintain myself here anymore. I can see that, the Hollow muttered. But I don't understand why you aren't stopping it. Why? You could do so easily. If Quincy powers are all you need to maintain yourself. The gaze towards the Edala's form of Ichigo in the distance was all the Hollow needed to do to ask his unspoken question. To his surprise, however, the old man shook his head. I can't. It would not be right. You think you aren't ruthless enough? If it's for Ichigo's sake, I've seen what you are willing to do. Look at all you did to me just so you could stay in control here. Clenching his fists tightly, the Hollow felt anger swell up inside him. So why after all that are you abandoning him now? You've done so much, so what is one more act to protect him? Why are you running away now? Why are you dying? The old man tilted his head, the confusion setting in for a moment until a soft smile appeared across his face. You sound sad, Hollow. Is my disappearance that upsetting to you? He turned away before the Hollow could answer, instead once again gazing at the world around him. After a few moments of silence, he finally said, I can't do it anymore. You can't? Or won't? They are both the same now, the old man replied. I've been here for so long. Countless years as Ichigo grew up. Countless years of watching him struggle and fight for what he wanted to protect. I was but a fragment of what Waiwak was, only existing because the inner world Ichigo possessed as a Shinigami managed to resonate with the power of the absorb that Ichigo gained from Waiwak before he was born. But back then I was little more than a poor copy of Waiwak. The more I stayed here, the more I gained from Ichigo and became something else. Waiwak could have done what you asked. But me. The old man shook his head. I can't any longer. Then this is really it, the Hollow muttered. Goodbye. The Hollow let out a laugh briefly, filled with annoyance and disappointment. Funny. Always thought I'd be saying that when I killed you for what you did to me. I was finally coming to terms with the fact that I wouldn't need to say that too. Uncertainly plagued the Hollow's actions before he saw a hand held out before him, a sad smile on the face of the owner of the arm. Goodbye Zanjitsu, the old man stated, the Hollow taking it after a few moments of uncertainty. And you too. Goodbye. Zanjitsu. The Hollow only stayed long enough to see the old man's eyes widen in shock before he released his grip, throwing himself off the building and out of sight. He finally called you Zanjitsu, Mavis spoke from behind him, the old man unsurprised to find the small girl standing there. Must be odd to hear that from him. It is, the old man replied, the smile on his face happier than before. Perhaps it means at least some of the things I've done I've managed to redeem myself for. A shame my original self can't do the same. You changed. He appears to have stayed the same. I've noticed. The old man took one last look around the world before turning towards Mavis. Have you dealt with the rogue memories? Oh? You noticed. The old man scoffed at her. I was the first here. There is little that changes here that I have never been aware of. My question? I've sorted it for now, Mavis replied simply. I'll have to handle it later. That would be for the best. Reaching out with one hand, he placed it on Mavis's shoulder. I leave him in your hands now. Protect him. Never abandon him. No matter how much pain he feels, he can endure so long as one person still stays by his side. Of course. I never plan to leave. Not ever. Thank you. This may be presumptuous of me to ask you this, but I have one last request to make. Mavis tilted her head curiously at him. What is it? Help. So I can protect Ichigo one last time. Protector of the fairies. Unable to take hearing Wendy's screams for longer than a second, Kelly lunged at the man before her, releasing all the magic she could gather quickly straight at him. The realization that it would all be sent right back at her and made twice as worse never even crossed her mind. All she cared about was taking away Wendy's pain, and the first step to doing that was to get this man away from her. It worked, somewhat. She forced him 2 steps away before he swiped up with his sword, and she felt the blade slash across her chest. The pain was blocked out by her rage, however, and for once in her life she welcomed the madness brought by her magic and let it control her entirely. Feathers of black wind burst into existence from her skin and scattered throughout the room, all being gathered back a moment later towards a point in front of her and released in a massive cyclone. Maybe it was because she had attacked when she had, but it was an attack Jugram could not stop. And so the Quincy was sent flying back, his shield's reflection hitting her instead of Wendy in the process. That didn't matter to her. She felt sanity return as pain filled her veins and her chest began to cave in, but all that could be healed. It couldn't for Wendy if she didn't act soon, but she couldn't do that if she had to turn her back to him like this. A wall suddenly appeared before her and the Quincy before she could think of a solution, her eyes blinking a few times before realizing the one standing between the two of them was Gildarts once again, shakily balancing on his one leg. I'll buy you as much time as I can, she heard him whisper back before he leapt forward. Whatever hopes she had of him putting up a decent fight were dashed at the sight of his speed, however. There was no force amplifying his movements, and she knew that he would do nothing to pose as a threat to Jugram as he was now. He was throwing his life away in the hopes it would buy them enough time to escape. She had to hurry. If she didn't, his sacrifice would be in vain. And yet she couldn't even think of a way that they might be able to escape at all. Jugram would never let them leave, that she was certain of. Those thoughts were confirmed when she saw Gildarts barely recover from an attempted jumping kick he tried, almost falling back to the ground and using all the energy he could to remain steady, being toyed with by Jugram. The Quincy no longer viewed this as a battle. Now he was just toying with Gildarts, the fear of what the man could do gone so long as the man lacked any magic to utilize his full strength. She shook her head rapidly, trying to get rid of those thoughts before they could make her give up all hope. She had to believe they still had a chance. So instead she turned away from the two fighters and focused all her attention on Wendy in the hope of being able to help her. The damage could have been much worse considering Jugram's initial appearance. If she hadn't attacked him when she did and forced his shield's reflection away from Wendy, she was sure Wendy would be dead right now. As it stood, that might still happen, but she had a chance to save Wendy. The problem was her chest though. Any cloth in the way had been shredded by that attack, so she didn't have any difficulties in seeing the damage. Her chest was caved in, halfway through her body instead of almost entirely. Bone and flesh had been reduced to nothing once the damage hit her, and it was a miracle the damage hadn't spread to her heart. Healing magic was already at the palm of her hand as she held it above the wound, and yet she could only have one thought. Could she really heal Wendy? A quick glance over her shoulder told her that Jugram had seen her attempts at healing, and yet he had made no moves towards her. Did that mean he already knew she couldn't do anything to save Wendy like this? No, he had to be messing with her. She could do this. Her attempts still did nothing, however. Wendy was losing too much blood far too quickly, and she couldn't replace the lost blood fast enough while also mending the body. Blood vessels needed to be remade, flesh needed to be grown and shaped, bone needed to be made and set correctly. There was too much for any one healer to do alone. With another sky magic user they might just be able to manage, but this was too much for one person alone. No matter what she did, she could already see the future before her as she watched as Wendy's magic slowly started to trickle away. Wendy was going to die. Can you heal her? She was shaking her head before she realized she didn't recognize the voice, turning her head to see the face of the old man she had seen a few times around Wendy. You're that old man. The one at the Grand Magic Games. The old man nodded briefly. My name is Nabera. I guess you could call me Wendy's grandfather for all intents and purposes. Nice to meet you, she muttered absently, her focus returning to Wendy as she tried to double her efforts, even as she knew it was only delaying the inevitable. I'm sorry for my earlier actions. Oh, it's not a problem. You're all right now, and everyone makes mistakes, Nabera stated, kneeling down beside her and looking at Wendy's body. You can't heal her, can you? I'm sorry, Kelia muttered. I can't. If you want to say some last words, I can help her hang on just for a bit longer. Not much, but it should be enough. I see, the old man replied, a resigned tone in his voice. She can't be healed like this, huh? His gaze slowly shifted away from Wendy towards the lacrima nearby. I had hoped it wouldn't come to this. I need you to do me a favor, please. A favor? Yes. It's still possible to save Wendy, but we need to move quickly. That grabbed Kelia's attention, her head snapping towards him. Take my lacrima. Quickly. Doing as he asked, Kelia carefully leaned out towards the lacrima, her fingers managing to grab the edge and roll it towards her while she maintained her attempts at healing Wendy. She was about to continue further when Nabera held up a hand towards her. You're going to interfere if you keep doing that. Leave this to me and my instructions. He did know what he was asking her to do, right? If she stopped healing Wendy like this, she would have maybe a minute left to live. At his continued glare, however, she reluctantly let the magic fade away before taking the lacrima in her hands. Now, the next step is a bit gruesome, Nabera stated carefully. Make an incision in her skin over her heart. Uncertain of what his end goal was, but knowing they were pressed for time, Kelia carefully did what he asked, being forced to pull away what little scraps were left of the cloth in her way. Very good, Nabera added as he stared at her work. Now, next step. Place my lacrima in the wound. What? We're running out of time. Do it now. But dash. Her heart is one of the areas closely linked to her magic core. I need that short distance to tap into her own magic to save her. Do you want her to live or not? She did. So even though she wasn't sure what it would do, she shoved the lacrima deep into the wound until only a small amount of the surface of the lacrima was visible, poking out of the large cut she had made. All right, she stated, looking towards Nabera for guidance. Now what? Now I take over, he stated quietly, vanishing completely as the lacrima began to glow. Black and white light burst to life all around Wendy's body, Kelia backing away on instinct when a few of the sparks of light came close to her. The sounds of fighting had suddenly drawn to an end and she turned to see Jugram staring at the sight in shock, Gildarts held up by his neck. "What is she doing?" Jugram spoke out loud, captivated by the sight as Wendy slowly began to float upwards. What had started as specks of light became beams, black and white streaks of light darting all across Wendy's body until finally tracing around where her chest had collapsed inwards from the damage given to her from Jugram. "Damage located," spoke Wendy, all emotion in her voice gone. Kelia could see the younger girl's eyes too as her body slowly began to tilt in the air. They were completely blank, like looking at a doll's. Beginning reconstruction. Error. Lacking necessary magical power. Procedure halted. Energy required. In Wendy's chest, Kelia could see the lacrima glow much brighter, and at the same moment she saw all the magic in the room being sucked towards Wendy, all the magic being funneled directly into her body to the point cracks began to appear across the girl's skin. Gathering of necessary energy complete. Proceeding with reconstruction. Gathering previous state. Locating missing entities. Displacing to area. Beams of light shot down towards the ground, touching the blood that had surrounded Wendy and causing it to all vanish from sight. Other beams reached towards the liquid on the ground that had once been flesh and bone, the substance reappearing over Wendy's chest as its shape began to morph back to normal. She wasn't sure if what she was seeing could be called a miracle. Piece by piece she watched as the scattered pieces of blood and flesh from Wendy's body was gathered back up by the magic, replaced and fixed back into place like it had never happened. She couldn't look away from the sight that was both disturbing and awe-inspiring, and she knew she wasn't the only one. Jugram was still frozen himself, as if unsure what to make of the magic before him. Finally, when all the flesh had returned to its original state, the magic began to dim. The last work it did was by the lacrima itself, the flesh slowly smoothing out and fusing to the lacrima until the two appeared to be joined naturally. Wendy's body slowly began to lower back down to the ground, and the second her feet touched the ground she almost fell, life reappearing in her eyes. The sight was enough to snap Kelia to action, lunging in and grabbing Wendy before she could fall. "Kelia?" Wendy asked in confusion, blinking a few times as she looked around at all three mages present. "What's wrong? What's happening?" "Impossible," muttered Jugram, staring at the sight of Wendy in pure shock. Complete reconstruction through displacement. Recreation of the original body's state through gathering of all pieces that had been damaged. This goes beyond healing, regeneration and even some forms of immortality. I was right. This girl. His eyes narrowed as he released his grip on Gildarts, letting the man fall to the ground. This girl must be eliminated now. Before Gildarts could scream out any sort of warning, Jugram was right before Wendy with his sword swinging down at the two girls, still clinging to one another. Neither of them could break away in time, but for Wendy, it was like such thoughts didn't matter. Her hand moved, almost like it was on autopilot, and light that was a mix of both black and white shone. Jugram was gone before his sword could finish its swing, only the disturbance left in the air proof that he had even been there. Releasing Wendy and spinning round to look at where the Quincy had been, Kelia couldn't stop her jaw dropping as she looked around and read the magic in the air. "Wendy! What did you do?" "That was Dash." "Nirvana," Wendy muttered, feeling drained as she fell to her knees. When did everything get so blurry, she wondered. Things had been so clear a second ago. Incredibly so. She hadn't just seen the way Nabara did, she had seen the knowledge too. Only snippets, pieces scattered but still right before her grasp. But now it was already beginning to slip away and she could feel the strain her body was undergoing greater than ever. Glancing down at herself, she noticed the cracks covering her skin, the same light of Nirvana shining out through the breaks in the skin. So that was what this felt like. There wasn't as much pain as she had expected, but her body still hurt. How had she even done this? She had vague memories of doing something. It was hazy, like looking through a fogged-up window, but she distinctively remembered feeling strange. Like there had been nothing beyond her grasp. "What did I do?" she asked quietly, looking up towards Kelia for answers. "I did something. But what?" You don't remember? Kelia asked in confusion. But you were talking. Was she? She could see the memory Kelia was talking about if she focused, but she didn't remember it ever happening. It was alien to her. You were pretty hurt, Kelia admitted in shame. I couldn't heal you. I wasn't good enough. So that old man, the one who called himself your grandfather, he suggested we try another method. She raised a finger before pressing it against Wendy's chest, right on top of the lacrima now embedded in her skin over her heart. We did this to you. It's a part of me, Wendy muttered, unsure of how exactly she knew that. The knowledge just felt right into her, but she couldn't even begin to understand how she had come to such a conclusion. But with such power, things were beginning to make more sense. Like those memories. Or perhaps it was Nabera and my subconscious, did something to fix me. Is that right? Kelia nodded, though Wendy could see a hint of unease in Kelia's expression. I'm not sure I can really call it healing, to be honest. It was more like you did a full reconstruction. Every bit of blood you split, every bit of flesh that broke away, you somehow gathered it all up and remade your body as it was before it even got injured. Wendy frowned. Full reconstruction? Did she do that all through Nirvana's power? Nabera had said he was capable of exchanging all things in the world, but did that even extend to such small items in such vast quantities? And what about the magic for such a spell? She knew she had the power to cast it, but where had all that additional energy come from? Certainly not Nabera himself. His lacrima didn't have much left for her to draw upon. But looking around, the air did seem odd. Like there was less magic present in the atmosphere compared to before. The cracks, the loss of magic around her. Could she have displaced all the magic into her own body? Was that even possible? Her thoughts drifted away though as she shivered, causing herself to look down only to blush bright red in embarrassment. My clothes. Oh, sorry, Kelia said in embarrassment herself, looking around for something she could use to cover Wendy. When your chest caved in, the damage destroyed most of your top, not that it hadn't been ruined already by the rest of the damage you took in your time in here. Pulling away more of it to get at your heart damaged what little was left. Sorry. Hold on a minute and I'll find you something. She can have my cloak, Gildarts called over, trying to pull it free by using his teeth. Kelia quickly rushed over to retrieve it before he finished and handed it over to Wendy, the younger girl wrapping it around herself like a blanket with only her hands and head sticking out. That better? Kelia asked, a still red-faced Wendy nodding quietly. Good. Now, do you know where you sent Jugram? This is important. Wendy frowned, pushing away her embarrassment in order to try and clearly remember what she did. Her mind still was a bit hazy at that time, but she remembered seeing him as a threat and wanting him gone. So with what power she could call upon quickly she had swiped up and then he was gone. Following that basic logic. I think he's above us, Wendy muttered honestly. I'm not sure how far though. It happened so fast. Up? Kelia asked, looking quickly towards the hole she knew lead straight to the surface. Nothing had come down from there yet, so what was Jugram waiting for? Had Wendy sent him so far up that he was struggling to recover? Or was there another reason? He had acted very quickly and precisely twice now towards Wendy. If she didn't know any better, she would say that he was afraid of her. Wendy gave her an odd look before she realized she had spoken her thoughts out loud. Sorry, just thinking. You're right though, Gildarts called over. Out of all of us, Jugram views her as the most dangerous threat, all because of Nirvana. A magic like that, its limits are probably beyond our own comprehension considering what we just saw. Jugram is likely worried of how much control she really has over such power and is trying to think of how he should procedure from here on out. When he next comes down that hole, he won't be playing around anymore. Then we fight, Kelia stated. If Wendy and I dash. It's useless, Wendy said, interrupting her suddenly. You can't do it alone and I don't think I'll be able to fight very well right now. Plus we don't have enough experience fighting him. Gildarts has to be the one to do it. Gildarts let out a laugh before replying to that. Sorry to disappoint, but I'm hardly in any condition to help anyone here. No matter how much I want to, I don't think I can stop him anymore. Not in my state, and certainly not with how little magical power I have left. Then let's fix that, Wendy replied calmly, her gaze unwavering as she stared at Gildarts. I did something to myself. I can tell that. I didn't have the magic to heal my body, but now I somehow have more magic than I had when I last checked. That means I used Nirvana to draw in energy. Correct. She is right, Kelia muttered before she realized where Wendy was going with this. Wait a minute. Are you saying dash? I am, Wendy replied. If I repeat the gathering process, I can redirect it all towards Gildarts. I should even be able to keep the flow constant, granting him more power than ever before. Though doing what you're suggesting, wouldn't that make him an existence similar to Anukin? Theoretically. I don't know really, Wendy admitted as she gripped the cloak around her tightly. It could all fail. It might not work. I don't know what will happen, and even if it works it will only last so long as I continue to supply the spell itself with magic. And there are other risks too. If Gildarts starts to absorb too much magic too quickly, his body will begin to suffer and crack. In his state dash. We don't have time to waste with what-ifs, Gildarts called over to her, struggling to get into a proper sitting position. No matter the risk, no matter the danger, I'll accept it all if it means protecting my family. I'll take that chance you're offering me, no matter how small it is. Yeah, you should be quick if you're going to do it, Kelia muttered, standing near the edge of the hole in the ceiling and peering upwards. I'm seeing some larger disturbances now. Jugram will probably be here dash. She never got a chance to finish that sentence, her words turning into a screech as she leapt back, just in time to avoid the swing of Jugram's sword from slicing her in two. He's here. Do it, Wendy. Jugram said nothing as his gaze shifted to the blue-haired girl, black and white light beginning to flicker around her form. Kelia made to send a wave of black wind at him only to find him gone, reappearing right before Wendy as he swung down at her. His blade came to a stop mere centimeters away from Wendy's head, the blade cracking under the form of the thing gripping it. And then once again the sword became nothing more than dust as the grip tightened and he was thrown away from Wendy, the form of Gildarts standing between the two of them. It took him a second to notice, and when he did he had to blink a few times to make sure his eyes weren't playing tricks on him. But there before him he saw all the proof he needed. Gildarts was standing on two legs, with two arms with fists clenched ready for any signs of danger. He knew those three limbs had not been there before. And no matter how powerful Nirvana was, there was no way it could recreate the limbs in the same way it did with Wendy's body. Which was why the fact the arms and leg were made of pure crash magic like before wasn't bothering him. Rather it was the very fact that they existed at the same time, and in such stable forms too, that did. There was no way Gildarts had the magical power left to even create a wave of crash magic strong enough to trip him up, let alone make and maintain these. So where was the magic coming from? Ah. The girl. It was the same trick as before that she used to replenish her reserves. He could see the flow of magic around them all, energy being pulled in towards Gildarts even though it had never shown any willingness to help him before. The man was not Nukin, and yet to his eyes it was as if he was thanks to the interference from that pesky sky priestess. Still, what did it matter? His script was still absolute in this battle. His power would not fail him. This attempt will only end in failure, finished Gildarts for him, a smirk on the man's face at the sight on Jugram's face. Sorry, but your thoughts were so obvious. Even my recovery doesn't faze you, does it? Not when you can ensure I end up the worst out of any of our clashes. Taking a step forward, Gildarts let his smirk drop. So I won't worry about clashes. I'll end this in one blow. And this time, I'll make sure you can't recover from it. Is that dash? Jugram never had a chance to finish, bringing up his still broken blade just in time to block the fist of Gildarts. His blade held up for maybe a second before it snapped in two, Jugram hastily retreating back in time to avoid Gildarts's fist making contact. He felt himself lucky that he did when the ground in the way of Gildarts's swing simply shattered, leaving nothing but rubble scattered across the ground. The right hit would decide the battle, Jugram decided there and then as he tapped his shield, his sword repairing itself as the damage moved to the shield itself. Depending on what attack hit him would determine what state the victor would be in. If a weak enough attack hit him, it would all be over for Gildarts. However, it was exactly because of that which made him dodge the next swipe, rushing past Gildarts with a burst of Hiran Kyoku to strike at the man's exposed back, only to be forced to step back in order to avoid the swing of a fist as Gildarts accelerated his spin back round to face him with crash magic. One wrong move. That was all it would take for one of them to fall. Just as a hit could be too weak, equally could it be too strong. If one of those hit him, Jugram knew he would be hard-pressed to recover. Every strike needed to be treated like it would be his end if he was hit by it, if he even wanted to survive. Another swing came and he dodged with ease, lunging in with his blade. An arm came into his path far too quickly and his momentum drove the blade deep into it. But this wasn't a normal arm. A wound like that would have crippled a limb, but for ones like Theseus, the crash magic that made it up just turned any metal that entered it back into dust. He darted back before Gildarts could hit him in retaliation, but he didn't even have time to repair his sword. Gildarts was already on him, his speed far greater than before. Was this a result of the excess magic the man had to spare? Gildarts' speed with crash magic was certainly much higher than before, giving him a clear advantage in such an enclosed area. Or was this merely how fast the man could move normally when using two legs? After facing the man trying to fight while hopping on one leg, this strong and powerful stance the man now used was throwing all his impressions off. "What are you thinking?" said Gildarts suddenly, interrupting his thoughts as a fist appeared straight before his eyes. Narrowly dodging the blow by leaning back, Jugram slashed up only for more of his sword to vanish as it met the magic arms of Gildarts. "Don't tell me you can't react anymore? Is this really all you've got? If that's the case, let me show you what you've forgotten. That am I fairy tales ace." This was dangerous. Far too dangerous. He had almost forgotten, but this was a man who had made His Majesty get serious with his final blow. He needed to end this all now before he could make a mistake. Rather than continuing to fight Gildarts, he instead sped past the man as fast as he could, swinging his broken blade towards Wendy in an attempt to kill her before it was too late. She was the source of Gildarts' newfound power, he was sure of it, so without her the man would crumble. The suddenly fear he felt from the very beginning of his fight with Gildarts hit him all at once, and instantly he knew he had made the mistake he had been trying desperately to avoid. Gildarts had appeared right in between the two of them, just as he swung, and the blade was now gone completely, vaporized by the left arm of Gildarts. The right arm meanwhile was clenched into a right fist, being swung up too fast for him to dodge. Crushing evil, spreading the truth, Empyrean. The fist slammed into Jugram at full force, the entirety of the power packed into that one limb exploded forward at once. Jugram's body was instantly gone, being forced upwards as everything shook. Wendy and Kelia couldn't stop themselves from being thrown back from the shockwaves while Jugram found himself thrown upwards. The earth above, however, appeared to stay level with him, even though he was getting further away from Gildarts. It was only for a moment, however, and then the earth began to fall as he tore upwards, the base they had all been under having been lifted up off the ground through the force of Gildarts' magic for a brief moment. His body was breaking. Jugram knew that. And yet he couldn't stop it. All he had to do was reach out and touch his shield. But his body would not respond, even though he had been thrown up into the sky by now and had nothing preventing him. The force simply wouldn't let his body recover or even move, continuing that way as his body finally began to give way. Like all things touched by crash magic, it slowly began to crumble away entirely, any attempts at defying Gildarts fading into the wind. When the force upwards finally stopped, all that was left of Jugram was a shattering shield, breaking into pieces for one final time to never be repaired again. Protector of the Fairies. Check the description for the links to the author.